Welcome to Sleepy Throne's Tales. Tonight, a gentle voyage into Cleopatra's life, where quiet power and careful longing meet. This story will follow the Queen's loves in order, patient, true, and unfolding like the Nile's current. The first light of dawn touched Alexandria with gold, painting the marble courtyards and lifting the mists from the harbor. In that soft light walked a young woman destined to become both legend and memory, Cleopatra, the seventh Philopator, last queen of the Ptolemaic dynasty. She was not merely beautiful, though beauty clung to her in every age's imagination. She was educated, shrewd, and fluent in the many tongues spoken along the Mediterranean trade routes. Where other monarchs relied on interpreters, Cleopatra herself could speak directly to sailors from Phoenicia, merchants from Judea, or scholars from Athens. Her childhood had not been a peaceful one. She was born into a royal house troubled by rivalry. The Ptolemies, descended from Alexander the Great's companions, had ruled Egypt for centuries, but their throne was never secure. Brother fought sister, sister married brother. Intrigue wound its way through the palace like ivy, and every feast hid whispers of betrayal. By the time Cleopatra reached her late teens, she shared the throne with her younger brother Ptolemy, 13, but their rule together soon broke into open conflict. Factions at court pushed the young boy forward as puppet king, while Cleopatra, with sharper instincts and greater maturity, was driven into exile. Yet destiny, like the Nile, shifted course. In 48 BCE, Rome's civil war spilled into Egypt. Pompey, the Great, once Caesar's ally, fled across the sea, hoping to find safety in Alexandria. Instead, he was murdered at the shoreline, a gift to Caesar offered by Ptolemy's advisors. When Julius Caesar himself arrived, grief and disapproval burned in his eyes. He had not wished to see Pompey slain in such a way. Caesar's presence changed everything. The greatest general of his age now walked within the marble halls of the Egyptian palace. Cleopatra, still in exile, understood this moment. If she could meet Caesar directly, she might regain her throne. But Ptolemy's guards stood against her. She could not simply walk into the palace. So, with the boldness that would define her life, she devised a plan remembered by storytellers through the centuries. Hidden in a roll of fine linen, some say a rug, others say a carpet, she was carried secretly into Caesar's chambers. There, unrolled before him, stood not a supplicant, but a queen. She spoke with grace, her words steady, her gaze unflinching. She offered alliance, intellect, and partnership. Caesar was 52, seasoned by war and politics. Cleopatra was barely 21, radiant with youth and determination. What began as necessity grew quickly into something more. He saw in her not only a partner for the moment, but a woman whose ambition matched his own, whose wit sparked conversation, and whose presence turned duty into fascination. Their bond, both political and personal, was sealed in those days of shared risk and rising trust by the following year. In 47 BCE, Cleopatra bore him a son, Ptolemy, the 15th Philopator Philometor, Caesar, whom Egyptians called Caesarion, Little Caesar. She declared proudly that this child was the son of Julius Caesar himself. For Egypt, Caesarion embodied a new hope, the blood of Rome's greatest general mingled with the line of pharaohs. Caesar did not marry Cleopatra. Roman law and his marriage to Calpurnia in Rome made that impossible, but he accepted her company, sailed with her along the Nile, and allowed whispers of acknowledgement to travel through the empire. Thus began the first great love in Cleopatra's life, not a tale of roses and serenades, but of survival, strategy, and intimacy born in the chambers of power. She had risked everything to place herself before Caesar, and in return she gained both her throne and a child who would carry 2 worlds in his name. The palace air carried a strange mix of tension and perfume. Behind its carved stone walls, Egypt's throne was being contested, and the Roman general had become its judge. Cleopatra had made her entrance, bold and unforgettable. But her presence did not dissolve the storm that raged in Alexandria. Ptolemy the 13th's advisors, furious at her alliance with Caesar, stirred resistance in the streets and called men to arms. Thus began the conflict, later remembered as the Alexandrian War. The city, jewel of the Mediterranean, became a battleground. Narrow lanes filled with shouting, and the harbor bristled with ships ready to cast fire upon their rivals. In those days of smoke and clamor, Cleopatra stood close beside Caesar. She was not hidden away like a frail consort. She was visible, commanding, advising. To Roman soldiers, she became the embodiment of Egypt itself, proud, enduring, worthy of defense. The fighting raged through the winter months. At one point, fire consumed parts of the great libraries, docks, and warehouses. And later, storytellers mourned scrolls lost in the blaze. Whether the whole library was destroyed, or only its outer collections, the event became a symbol of how even knowledge was vulnerable in the clash of empires. For Cleopatra, though, the central truth was survival. She had bound herself to Caesar, and together they weathered the storm. In March of 47 BCE, Caesar's reinforcements arrived, 4 legions under Mithridates of Pergamum, sweeping down into Egypt. The tide turned swiftly. Ptolemy the 13th, attempting to flee by boat during the final battle near the Nile, drowned in the waters that had once carried his ancestors' glory. With his death, Cleopatra's claim was secure. Rome had chosen its queen. Caesar declared Cleopatra ruler once more, though, in keeping with Ptolemaic custom, she was to share the throne with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, this time only a boy. But there was no doubt who held real power. She was queen, and behind her throne stood the might of Caesar's legions. In those quieter weeks after war, when Alexandria healed its wounds and rebuilt its markets, Caesar and Cleopatra's bond deepened into something more than alliance. Ancient writers describe banquets where they reclined side by side, drinking wine and listening to poets. Voyages upon the Nile where Cleopatra, dressed as Isis, sailed beside Caesar, who marveled at temples older than Rome itself. Theirs was not romance in the modern sense of letters and courtship, but a mingling of two ambitions, hers to restore Egypt's sovereignty, his to crown his Roman triumphs with Eastern wealth and wonder. It was in this union of necessity and fascination that their child was born. On a warm summer day of 47 BCE, Cleopatra gave birth to Caesarion. The court proclaimed him heir, his name echoing both the divine pharaohs and the conqueror of Rome. Cleopatra's joy was fierce, for this son was more than her child. He was proof that her bond with Caesar was real, and a symbol that her dynasty might yet survive. But whispers spread quickly. In Rome, men muttered that Caesar had taken a foreign queen as mistress, and that a child of Egypt might one day challenge the Roman order. For now, though such concerns were distant, in Alexandria, beneath skies filled with seabirds and sails, Cleopatra and Caesar lived as sovereigns, their laughter mingling with music, their evenings filled with the warmth of shared victory. The war was over. The smoke had lifted from Alexandria's harbor, and the cries of soldiers had given way once more to the murmur of markets, the rhythm of oars, and the slow, timeless breath of the Nile. In that quiet after conquest, Cleopatra chose to show Caesar not just her throne, but her kingdom itself. She invited him on a voyage up the Nile, a journey into Egypt's heart. The barge prepared for them was no ordinary vessel. Its deck gleamed with polished cedar, its sails were dyed purple, and its stern bore carvings of lotus and papyrus. At the center of it all, Cleopatra herself appeared dressed as Isis, the goddess of fertility and rebirth, her golden diadem catching the sunlight. Caesar, whose eyes had long been trained on legions and campaigns, found himself struck by a different kind of power, the majesty of a queen who embodied both mortal ruler and divine presence. As the barge glided upriver, the Nile unrolled its ancient secrets. Villages paused their labor in the fields to watch their queen pass by, standing tall beside the Roman general. Temples rose along the bank's great stone guardians, carved with hieroglyphs that whispered of kings who had reigned 1,000 years before Caesar's Rome had even been dreamed. Cleopatra narrated the history of each monument, her voice weaving myth with memory. Caesar, fascinated, listened not as a conqueror, but as a guest, at night, under velvet skies heavy with stars. Torches lit the barge, and music drifted across the water. Wine was poured, honey cakes served, and the two rulers reclined on cushions, speaking of gods, of war, of destiny. Caesar spoke of Rome's future, his visions of reform, his hunger for power, tempered by the constant resistance of jealous senators. Cleopatra listened, her eyes bright, and told him of Egypt's need for stability, of her dream to unite the ancient majesty of the pharaohs with the modern strength of Rome. In those nights, something warmer than politics grew between them. Caesar, older and weathered by decades of struggle, found in Cleopatra not only a partner but a kind of renewal. She, young yet already tested by exile and war, found in him the assurance of protection and the spark of admiration. Their intimacy was not the fleeting kind of passing lovers, but a companionship steeped in shared ambition. When laughter rose between them, it carried both tenderness and strategy for the people who lined the Nile's banks. The sight of Cleopatra and Caesar together became legend. Many whispered that the goddess Isis herself had taken a Roman god as consort. Children pointed to the barge, and later would tell stories of the day when the Queen of Egypt and the ruler of Rome drifted past, golden in the sun. It was on this voyage that Cleopatra's power as both woman and monarch shone most brightly. She was no longer a fugitive wrapped in linen, but a sovereign adored, sailing the waters of her ancestors with the strongest man in the world at her side. And in Caesar's quiet gaze, she saw not only alliance, but desire, a recognition that this love, born of necessity, had deepened into something unforgettable. The Nile voyage came to its gentle close, but the bond it sealed did not end when the barge docked once more at Alexandria. Caesar, though consumed by the endless currents of Roman politics, lingered longer than anyone expected. Months passed, with him at Cleopatra's side, months in which she ruled with new confidence, the streets of her city alive with the sense that Egypt's queen was stronger than ever. But Rome could not wait forever. Caesar's victories had secured his power, yet enemies still conspired. He knew he must return to the Tiber's banks to hold his place in the Senate and secure the future he dreamed of. And so, reluctantly, he prepared to leave. Cleopatra, crowned anew and mother to his child, watched as the man who had restored her throne readied his sails for distant shores. In the autumn of 46 BCE, Cleopatra herself traveled to Rome, bringing with her the young Caesarion and her retinue of Egyptian attendants. When she arrived, whispers raced through the city like wildfire. For the Roman people, she was a vision both strange and magnetic, a foreign queen robed in gold thread linen, her dark eyes proud, her speech laced with the rhythms of another world. To some she was a marvel, to others a threat. Caesar lodged her not far from his own villa, a bold choice that confirmed what many already suspected, that their bond was not a passing affair. Yet even as Cleopatra stayed in Rome, Caesar remained married to Calpurnia. This contradiction only fueled the gossip. Senators frowned at the thought that their general, their would-be dictator, had taken a queen of the East as his consort. What would happen if he sought to raise her son as heir? What would it mean if Egypt and Rome's destinies were tied by blood? Still, for a time, Cleopatra enjoyed the city's splendor. She walked its avenues, saw its temples, and marveled at its triumphal parades. Caesar, ever the showman, honored her with statues that portrayed her as Isis, goddess of love and rebirth. The common folk, charmed by spectacle, watched in wonder as Egypt's queen stood amidst Rome's grandeur. But the Senate grumbled, their unease deepening with every gesture of Caesar's favor in private. Their moments together carried a different kind of quiet. Far from the murmurs of the forum, they spoke of their son, of the Nile, of dreams beyond, politics. For Cleopatra, Rome was a world both alien and dangerous, yet with Caesar beside her, she felt untouchable. For Caesar, she was both lover and symbol, proof that his reach extended beyond Rome, into lands ancient and mysterious. But the city that had raised him would not forgive easily. Behind the marble pillars, daggers of resentment were already being sharpened. To love Cleopatra in Alexandria had been one thing, to bring her into Rome's heart was another. And though Caesar cared little for gossip, Cleopatra could sense it, the undercurrent of envy, fear, and betrayal that drifted just beneath Rome's surface. For now, though, the world was theirs. The Queen of Egypt and the ruler of Rome walked together through the capital, their son's future shimmering like a mirage ahead. They could not yet see the shadows gathering, but soon the whispers would become thunder. Rome was restless. The streets rang with shouts of triumph, for Caesar had returned victorious from every corner of the world. His name was etched on monuments, his face struck on coins, his power unmatched. Yet in the whispers of the Senate, discontent was swelling, and Cleopatra, ever perceptive, could feel the unease curling like smoke through the marble halls. She remained in the villa across the Tiber, her presence impossible to ignore. Caesar visited her often, slipping away from the demands of state to spend hours in her company. They spoke of Egypt's temples, of Rome's legions, of Caesarion's future. To Cleopatra, these moments were precious fragments of intimacy. Set against the roar of an empire, she had come not only as lover, but as diplomat, binding Egypt's survival to the man who held Rome in his hand. Yet the Romans looked on with suspicion. They resented the honors Caesar heaped upon her. Statues of Cleopatra as Isis rose in public spaces, and some whispered that their general dreamed of wearing a crown beside her, of uniting Rome and Egypt under one divine monarchy. To the senators, this was treachery. Rome had driven out kings centuries before. The very word rex was poison. On winter nights, Cleopatra reclined in her chamber, watching the flame of an oil lamp flicker against the painted walls, and wondered at the path ahead. She was young, yet already a queen and a mother. She had faced exile, war, and triumph. But here in Rome, her power was fragile, dependent on Caesar's protection. She saw how his allies bowed with forced smiles, how daggers of envy flashed in their eyes. She told herself that their love was strong enough to weather this storm. Yet a tremor of unease stirred within her heart. Then came the spring of 44. BCE, Caesar had been named dictator perpetuo, dictator for life. The Senate chamber rang with reluctant applause, but beneath the echo lay hatred. Cleopatra knew enough of politics to sense danger, though even she could not have foreseen how swiftly the blow would fall. On the morning of March 15th, Caesar walked into the theater of Pompey, where the Senate gathered beneath painted ceilings. Cleopatra, across the river, tended to Caesarion, unaware that history's tide was about to shift forever. Inside the chamber, conspirators closed in. They struck with blades, one after another, until the man who had bestrode the world like a colossus fell at their feet. Word raced through Rome like wildfire. Caesar was dead. The city plunged into chaos. Citizens wept in the streets. Senators fled for safety. Cleopatra, upon hearing the news, felt the floor drop from beneath her. The man who had restored her throne, who had fathered her child, who had promised her protection, was gone. She was once more a foreign queen in a city that did not love her. With enemies circling on every side, gathering Caesarion and her retinue, she withdrew swiftly from Rome. Her dreams of a shared dynasty with Caesar were ashes, but even in grief, her resolve did not falter. Cleopatra would return to Alexandria, to the Nile, to her people. And there, in the heart of Egypt, she would decide how to carve a future from the ruins of love. The news of Caesar's death spread like fire across the Mediterranean. In Alexandria, the people mourned in their own way, for they knew that the queen who had been tied so closely to Rome's greatest man would now stand on shifting sands. For Cleopatra, the journey home from Rome was not triumphant, but heavy with sorrow. She sailed the same waters that had once carried her and Caesar on their radiant voyage, but now the Nile's current seemed colder, its surface darker. She carried with her not only memories, but a living bond. Caesarion, the child of their union, still only a toddler. As the Egyptian sun warmed the decks once more, she held him close and whispered promises. You are your father's son. You are the future of Egypt. In his eyes, she saw a reflection of Caesar's gaze, sharp, commanding, unyielding, and in that reflection she gathered strength. Upon her return, Alexandria greeted her with reverence. The queen had come back, crowned not only by her own throne, but by her connection to the most powerful man the world had known. Yet behind the city's cheers lay questions. Without Caesar, what would become of Egypt? Would Rome's shifting powers seek to control her once more? Would her son be recognized as heir, or dismissed as a whisper of scandal? Cleopatra wasted no time. She entered the palace with her head high, dressed in shimmering linen and crowned with the uraeus of the pharaohs. She summoned her council, reaffirming her authority. Egypt, she declared, would endure. She spoke of Caesarion not as a secret child, but as the rightful heir of both Egypt and Rome. The courtiers bowed, though some whispered uneasily, for to invoke Caesar's name was to court both reverence and danger at night. When the palace corridors grew quiet, Cleopatra allowed her heart to soften. She thought of Caesar not as a general or ruler, but as the man who had shared wine with her under the stars, who had marveled at Egypt's temples, who had laughed with her as their son first grasped his hand. She grieved in silence, the weight of her love balanced against the burden of her crown. Yet Cleopatra was not one to linger in despair. She understood that Rome, though fractured, would send new leaders, new emissaries, perhaps even new threats. Already, whispers reached her of Mark Antony, Caesar's trusted general, and of Octavian, Caesar's young heir by adoption. Both men would rise in the power struggle that followed the Ides of March. Both men would turn their eyes toward Egypt in time. But for now, the Nile embraced her. In the cool evening air, she stood upon the palace terrace, the city lights flickering below, the river gleaming like a ribbon of silver. She was once again sovereign of her own land, without Caesar's shadow beside her. Her love had ended in blood and betrayal, but her story was far from finished. In her arms, Caesarion stirred, and Cleopatra whispered again into the night, "The world has taken your father, my son, but it will not take you." The seasons turned as Cleopatra settled once more into the rhythms of her kingdom. The Nile rose and fell, its waters bringing life to the fields, its currents carrying ships heavy with grain. bound for distant shores. In the palace at Alexandria, the queen ruled with renewed resolve. Her son, Caesarion, growing by her side like a small sun, warming her heart even as the memory of Caesar lingered like a haunting fragrance. But beyond Egypt's borders, Rome was descending into chaos. Caesar's death had not restored the Republic as the conspirators had hoped. Instead, it opened the gates to civil war. His allies rallied, and from their ranks emerged two men who would soon shape Cleopatra's destiny. Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, his loyal general, charismatic and powerful, beloved by soldiers, and Gaius Octavian, Caesar's grandnephew and adopted son, young yet cunning, ambitious beyond measure. Cleopatra knew both names, and she studied the reports carefully. Antony was known for his fiery speeches, his boldness, his taste for luxury and revelry. Octavian was quieter, deliberate, a serpent wrapped in silk. Both now vied for power, their conflict threatening to spill into Egypt's sphere. For Cleopatra, the lesson of Rome was clear. To survive, she must choose her allies wisely. In Alexandria, she cultivated strength. She expanded the city's harbors, filled the granaries, and restored temples, reminding her people that Egypt remained prosperous under her hand. Scholars returned to the library. Scribes worked late into the night. Priests carried incense through gilded sanctuaries. Cleopatra moved among them with regal grace, draped in robes of white linen trimmed in gold, her crown shining in the light of oil lamps. The queen was no shadow of Caesar. She was Egypt incarnate. Still, her heart was not untouched. In quiet moments, she gazed upon Caesarion, watching the boy's curls glisten like sunlit bronze, his small hand clutching hers as they walked the palace gardens. She imagined a future where he might bridge Rome and Egypt, where he might rule as heir to two worlds. But she knew the Romans would not easily accept him. To them, Octavian was Caesar's heir. Caesarion was a complication to be erased. As rumors of Rome's strife reached Alexandria, Cleopatra prepared. She stocked Egypt's arsenals with weapons, trained her fleets, and watched the stars for guidance. She trusted in her intellect, in her beauty, in the mystique of her throne. She had faced exile and loss before, and she would not falter now. Meanwhile, in Rome, Antony rose in prominence, his name shouted by legions who adored him. It would not be long before fate would carry him across the sea to Alexandria, into Cleopatra's orbit. But for now, the queen waited, poised between memory and destiny, her heart scarred, yet still capable of love, beneath the stars of Egypt. She whispered to herself, "The gods do not end a story at its middle. Another chapter is coming." The civil wars raged in Rome. Senators schemed, soldiers marched. Alliances shifted like sand, yet one name grew louder with every passing month. Mark Antony, the man who had stood beside Caesar on countless battlefields, now carried the loyalty of legions, but his power was incomplete. He needed wealth, ships, and grain to sustain his war, and for that he turned his eyes toward Egypt. Cleopatra knew it was only a matter of time. The Nile's riches were unmatched, and Egypt's fleet could tip the balance of Rome's wars. Yet she also knew Antony's reputation. He was bold, magnetic, a man who lived as fiercely as he fought. Tales of his revels, his laughter, his indulgence in wine and pleasure had reached Alexandria long before his summons did. He was no calculating Octavian. He was fire itself. When the summons arrived, Cleopatra deliberated carefully. To ignore him was to risk Antony's wrath. To go was to open herself to a new entanglement with Rome. But she remembered Caesar, and remembered too that Egypt must stand strong in the storm. With regal composure, she accepted that Cleopatra did not travel to Antony as a supplicant. She prepared as a goddess. A barge was crafted for her journey up the Kidnus River, its sails purple, its oars of silver flashing in the sunlight. She reclined beneath a canopy of gold, dressed as Aphrodite, goddess of love, while incense drifted from censers and music filled the air. Attendants, dressed as cupids, fanned her with feathers. To all who watched, she was no mortal queen. She was divinity itself. When Antony saw her arrival, he was struck silent. The soldiers who adored him now turned their gaze to her, captivated. Cleopatra had not merely answered his summons, she had conquered it. Antony, famed for his own charisma, found himself disarmed. That night, as the city feasted, Cleopatra and Antony spoke for the first time. She matched his wit with sharp intelligence, his humor with radiant laughter. He boasted of campaigns and victories. She countered with tales of the Nile, of temples older than Rome itself. Their banter flowed like wine, playful yet charged with something deeper. Antony was not blind to her allure. She was beautiful, yes, but more than that, she was clever, confident, and utterly fearless. Cleopatra, in turn, saw in him what Caesar had lacked: warmth, passion, a man who embraced life with reckless abandon. She had loved Caesar for his power, but Antony stirred her in another way. As the feast drew late into the night, Antony leaned closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You are no queen," he whispered with a smile. "You are a miracle." Cleopatra's eyes glimmered in the torchlight. "Then treat me as one, and you may yet share in my wonders." It was the beginning of a bond that would eclipse politics, a love fierce and unrestrained, destined to alter the fate of empires. After their first meeting, Cleopatra did not rush into Antony's arms. nor did she bend hastily to his power. Instead, she invited him into Alexandria, into her world, a city that pulsed with beauty, learning, and decadence. Antony, accustomed to the rigid discipline of Roman camps, found himself intoxicated by the city's splendor and by the queen who ruled it. By day, they held councils in marbled halls, speaking of fleets and alliances, of Caesarion's future, and of Rome's endless wars. By night, Alexandria transformed. Banquets overflowed with rare delicacies, figs filled with honey, roasted birds laced with spices, goblets brimming with Egyptian wine. Musicians played harps and flutes as dancers wove between gilded columns, their shadows flickering in torchlight. Cleopatra and Antony did not merely attend these revels, they became their heart. Together, they founded what Alexandrians would later call the Inimitable Livers, a society devoted to pleasure, wit, and daring. Disguised as commoners, they wandered the city's streets at midnight, drinking in taverns, laughing among fishermen, tossing coins to children who played by the harbor. Antony, the great Roman general, reveled in this freedom. Cleopatra, radiant beside him, seemed more goddess than queen. Their laughter echoed through the marble corridors of the palace. They challenged each other with riddles, teased each other with playful wagers. Cleopatra once bet Antony she could spend the most extravagant sum at a single banquet. When the feast concluded, Antony laughed, believing she had lost. Then Cleopatra removed one of her pearl earrings, vast, priceless, shimmering like moonlight, dropped it into a goblet of vinegar, and when it dissolved, she drank. Antony could only marvel at her audacity, conceding her victory with a smile. But beneath the revelry, their bond deepened into something more profound. Cleopatra confided in him her fears for Caesarion, her longing for Egypt's independence, her memories of Caesar's embrace and of his tragic end. Antony, in turn, revealed his own wariness of wars without end, of Roman politics gnawed by envy, of the heavy mask of command. With Cleopatra, he could be not only a general, but a man, laughing freely, speaking openly, loving fiercely. One night, as dawn's first light brushed the sea, Antony stood with Cleopatra on the palace balcony. The city below slept in silence, the Nile gleaming pale gold. He took her hand and whispered, "Rome may call me its master, but here, with you, I am only your servant." Cleopatra's eyes softened. "No," she answered gently, "you are not my servant. You are my equal. And together we are more than Rome can ever understand." Thus, their love, born in spectacle, grew into intimacy, a union of passion and ambition, destined to challenge the might of the world. For many months, Antony lingered in Alexandria. The city's golden light, its music and laughter, its queen, all held him fast. But even in the arms of Cleopatra, he could not escape the shadow of Rome. Messengers arrived daily, bearing news of campaigns left unattended, of Octavian's maneuvers, of senators whispering against him in marble halls. Rome was a restless beast, and it demanded his return. Cleopatra sensed his unease. Some nights she found him pacing the palace chambers, his hands clenched behind his back, eyes fixed on the horizon. He spoke of Rome as though it were both a lover and a rival, a force that refused to release him. "You are torn," she said softly, one evening, placing her hand upon his arm. Antony sighed, his voice heavy. "Rome is my duty, my curse. With you I am alive, but in Rome my destiny calls." For Cleopatra, the thought of losing him was bitter. She remembered Caesar, how he, too, had been called away, how his return had ended in blood and daggers. Yet she also knew the truth. Antony was no Egyptian king. He was a Roman, bound to Rome's endless wars. To hold him by force was to invite his resentment, so she let him go, but not without weaving her presence into his heart. Before he departed, she led him into the temple of Isis, where incense curled in the air and lamps flickered like stars. There she placed a garland of lotus upon his brow and whispered, "You may leave Alexandria, but you will not leave me. Wherever Rome takes you, my image will walk beside you. The Nile's waters run in your blood now." Antony moved, drew her into his arms. "I will return," he swore, his voice rough with emotion. "Not as a guest, not as a conqueror, but as yours." When his ships finally departed, the harbor of Alexandria filled with the sound of horns and oars cutting through the sea. Cleopatra stood upon the palace balcony, Caesarion at her side, her eyes fixed on the horizon until the sails vanished. She held herself with the poise of a queen, but within, her heart ached with the sharp pain of absence. In Rome, Antony would face new trials, alliances, betrayals, and the relentless climb of Octavian. But in Egypt, Cleopatra carried his promise like a flame. She turned her gaze toward the Nile, whispering to the winds, "Return to me before the gods decide otherwise." It was the beginning of distance, of longing, of the fragile threads that tie lovers across seas. And though Antony's heart belonged to her, Rome was never far behind, pulling at him with invisible chains. When Antony returned to Rome, he entered a world far colder than Alexandria's warmth. The marble city, grand yet severe, was rife with intrigue. Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, had grown stronger, weaving alliances with careful precision. Senators whispered of Antony's indulgence in Egypt, of his reckless abandon, of his dangerous entanglement with a foreign queen. To survive Rome, Antony needed more than legions. He needed alliances. And Octavian, though sly and calculating, offered him a bond that could not be ignored: marriage into his family. The terms were clear: to quiet suspicion, to bind himself to Rome's future, Antony was to wed Octavia, Octavian's sister, a woman of grace, virtue, and quiet strength. The ceremony was modest compared to the revels of Alexandria. No music of flutes, no purple, sails only the stern vows of Rome, spoken beneath the eyes of the Senate and the gods. Octavia, draped in pure white, was a picture of Roman dignity. She did not weep nor smile, but accepted her role with the calm obedience expected of her. Antony, for his part, fulfilled his duty, yet even as he placed his hand in hers, his mind wandered east to a queen who had once dissolved a pearl in wine and laughed as the world watched in wonder. Octavia bore him respect, even kindness. She sought harmony, tried to bridge the growing chasm between her brother and her husband. But Antony's heart was not hers to win. Each letter, each report from Egypt of Cleopatra's strength, of Caesarion's growth, reignited the flame he carried. Rome might bind his hand, but Egypt held his soul. Cleopatra, meanwhile, received the news of Antony's marriage with fury veiled in composure. She had known Rome would ensnare him, but the reality struck deep. Alone in her palace, she paced the marble floors, her fingers clenched around a scroll that bore his name. For a time, she feared she had been but a season in Antony's life, a fleeting indulgence to be cast aside when duty called. Yet she also knew Antony. He was a man of passion, not calculation. Rome could place a wife in his bed, but it could not replace what burned between them. So Cleopatra waited, not passively, but with intent. She strengthened Egypt's fleets, gathered wealth, and ensured that when Antony looked east again, he would see not only a lover, but a partner, a queen whose power could rival even Octavian's. Ambition. In Rome, Antony played the role expected of him, but there were moments when he faltered. At banquets, his eyes would drift to the corner of the room, as if searching for a figure who was not there. In dreams, he smelled the perfume of lotus blossoms, heard the lapping of the Nile, felt the press of Cleopatra's hand in his Rome, had gained a wife for him, but Cleopatra remained his love, and soon the tides of war would draw him back to her, no matter the vows spoken in marble halls. Years passed, and Rome grew ever more divided. Octavian strengthened his grip with cunning words and quiet threats, while Antony, though bound by his marriage to Octavia, found himself restless, torn, and unsatisfied. His heart remained in Alexandria, where the Nile flowed like eternity, and Cleopatra reigned like a goddess at last. The moment came when Rome's demands drove him east once more. Command was needed in the provinces. Wars awaited across the seas, and Antony seized the chance to journey back toward the lands where love, not duty, awaited him. His fleet set sail, cutting through the waves, bound once again for Egypt. Cleopatra, forewarned of his arrival, prepared not as a queen uncertain of her place, but as one certain of her worth. She adorned herself in shimmering silks, her chambers perfumed with lotus and myrrh, her throne hall bright with gold and precious stones. Yet when the doors opened and Antony entered, there was no need for grandeur. Their eyes met, and all the years, all the vows, all the politics fell away. He strode toward her, and before the court he took her hand and kissed it with a fervor no Roman restraint could hide. The hall erupted in whispers, courtiers bowing low, but Cleopatra heard only the thrum of her own heart. That night the palace rejoiced. Banquets flowed again with wine, music rose through the corridors, laughter filled the marble halls. Antony and Cleopatra dined side by side, their hands brushing, their glances lingering. In the privacy of her chambers, their reunion deepened, no longer restrained by longing, but alive in the heat of presence. Antony held her as if she were both queen and salvation. Cleopatra whispered his name, as though weaving it into eternity. In days that followed, their bond grew fiercer still. They resumed their adventures through Alexandria's streets, disguised in plain cloaks, laughing as they joined fishermen casting nets, sharing bread with merchants, tasting wines in crowded taverns. Wherever they went, they were together, not just lovers, but companions, conspirators, in joy. But beyond pleasure lay strategy. Cleopatra saw the rising storm in Rome, the clash that was inevitable between Antony and Octavian. She pressed him to think of Caesarion of Egypt's role in what was to come. Antony, gazing into her eyes, promised her more than words. He promised partnership, not as Rome's general who took a queen for a mistress, but as a man who embraced her as his equal. One evening, as the Nile shimmered under the moon, Antony and Cleopatra stood upon the deck of a royal barge. He placed his arm around her and murmured, "Rome gave me a crown of duty. You give me a crown of life. I am yours, Cleopatra, not by conquest, but by choice." She leaned against him, her voice soft as the river's tide. Then together, we will write a story Rome cannot erase. The lovers had reunited, and now, hand in hand, they prepared to defy the empire itself. In the months following Antony's return, Alexandria glittered brighter than ever. The city pulsed with revels, banquets, and grand processions. But beneath the music and wine, something greater stirred. Cleopatra and Antony were weaving their love into power. They declared themselves not merely lovers, but partners, equals joined in destiny. Cleopatra, draped in gold and crowned with the sacred sun disk of Isis, appeared beside Antony, clad in Roman armor, his cloak trimmed with Egyptian jewels. Together they sat upon twin thrones, presiding over festivals that merged the splendor of two worlds. Whispers spread swiftly in Alexandria. Antony was no longer merely a Roman general. He was Pharaoh's consort, a king beside the queen. There, love spilled beyond the palace into policy. Antony bestowed lands upon Cleopatra, granting her dominion over parts of Syria, Cyprus, and Cilicia, gifts that restored Egypt's ancient glory. Cleopatra, in turn, offered him fleets, wealth, and loyalty that Rome could not match. In the heart of their union, Caesarion was raised not as a hidden child, but as a prince, his mother's eyes bright with ambition for him. Yet their intimacy was not only forged in strategy, and spoke as two souls stripped of crowns. Antony shared tales of his youth, of battles fought in mud and fire, of scars that still ached when storms passed. Cleopatra confided in him her loneliness as a girl queen, the endless burden of being seen as goddess and ruler, but rarely as woman. One night, while reclining upon silken cushions in a chamber scented with roses, Cleopatra turned to him and whispered, "Rome calls me foreign. To them I am temptation, seduction, danger. But to you, Antony, who am I?" He looked into her dark eyes, fierce and tender all at once. "You are the world I did not know I was searching for. Rome gave me battles, you give me life." And in those words, Cleopatra found what even Caesar had not given her, not conquest, but recognition. Antony did not seek to shape her of love. Scholars gathered in the great library. Artists painted frescoes of gods embracing under stars. Merchants filled the harbors with exotic wares. Yet beyond Egypt's borders, Rome's whispers grew louder. To Octavian, this union was no mere affair. Of hearts it was a threat to his power, a declaration that Antony no longer served Rome, but Egypt's queen. Still, within Alexandria's golden walls, Cleopatra and Antony cared little for distant voices. Together they laughed, feasted, and dreamed. Together they forged a kingdom of two, bound not just by passion, but by purpose. Even as Alexandria thrived in splendor, Rome seethed with unrest. Reports of Antony and Cleopatra's union reached the marble halls of the Senate, carried by merchants, spies, and rival envoys. What they described sounded less like a Roman general, fulfilling his duty, and more like a king enthralled by an Eastern queen. They whispered of Antony sitting upon a throne beside Cleopatra, of lands granted to her as if she were Rome's equal, of banquets where Antony dressed as Dionysus, god of wine, while Cleopatra appeared as Isis reborn. Too many senators, this was scandal. To Octavian, it was opportunity. Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, had long resented Antony's charisma and reputation, but now he possessed a weapon sharper than any sword: public opinion. Before the Senate, he painted Antony not as a statesman or commander, but as a man bewitched. Antony, Octavian declared, his voice ringing beneath the marble dome, has abandoned Rome. He kneels to a foreign queen, squanders our provinces, and raises her child as Caesar's heir. Will we stand idle while the Republic is betrayed by passion? These words fell upon eager ears. Many senators, wary of Cleopatra's power and wary too of Egypt's riches, found it easy to believe, and so Rome's whispers grew into storms: that Antony was lost to lust, that Cleopatra was a sorceress, that together they sought to build an empire against Rome itself. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra knew of these accusations, but met them with calm resolve. She had long understood how the world saw her: exotic, dangerous, too clever for comfort. Yet, with Antony at her side, she was not afraid. Together, they laughed at the idea of Rome's slanders, dismissing them as the cries of jealous men who could not fathom a union of equals. Still, the shadow lingered. At night, as Antony reclined with her on terraces overlooking the Nile, he could not shake the thought of Octavian's cunning. He remembered Rome's senators, how swiftly loyalty turned to betrayal, how easily words became daggers. Cleopatra, seeing his unrest, placed her hand upon his chest. Let Rome whisper, let Octavian plot. Their words cannot pierce what we have built here. This city, this love, this kingdom, it is ours. The Nile flows eternal, and so shall we. Her voice steadied him, yet he knew the storm was coming. For love as grand as theirs could not remain hidden within Egypt's golden walls. Rome demanded its share of every story, and Octavian would not rest until Antony was torn from Cleopatra's embrace or destroyed within it. And so, beneath the starlit skies of Alexandria, while lovers feasted and the city sang, the seeds of war began to take root, watered by jealousy, ambition, and fear. Alexandria's great gymnasium, vast enough to hold tens of thousands, was filled with anticipation. From the colonnades hung banners of purple and gold, while incense curled through the air like divine breath. Citizens from every walk of life gathered, pressing forward to witness what had been whispered about for weeks, a spectacle unlike any the city had ever seen. At the heart of it all stood Antony and Cleopatra, side by side, upon golden thrones raised upon a dais. Yet this day was not merely a display of wealth, it was a declaration. Cleopatra, entered first, robed as Isis, her crown gleaming with the horns of Hathor, her presence radiant and serene. Beside her, Antony appeared as Dionysus, clad in flowing robes of crimson, crowned with ivy leaves, his bearing both regal and indulgent. The crowd gasped, for here were no mortals. Here stood gods reborn, uniting east and west in splendor before the assembled multitude. Antony rose and proclaimed what would be known as the donations of Alexandria. In a voice carrying a cross, the marble arches, he declared, Caesarian, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, the rightful king of kings, heir to Caesar's divine legacy. Cleopatra, radiant in her glory, sat with her son upon her lap, her eyes glimmering with triumph. But Antony's gifts did not end there. To Cleopatra's children, by him Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and little Ptolemy Philadelphus, he granted vast dominions, lands stretching from Armenia to Cyrene, from Phoenicia to the deserts beyond the Nile. These territories, once controlled by Rome, were now bestowed upon Egypt's heirs, a gesture bold enough to make the senators in faraway Rome tremble with rage. The people of Alexandria erupted in cheers, their voices echoing like thunder. They rejoiced not only in the gifts, but in the union that made them possible. Their queen and her Roman lover had woven destiny itself into the future of Egypt. That night, celebrations swept through the city. Feasts spilled into the streets. Torches illuminated the harbor, and music swirled like the tide of the Nile. Cleopatra and Antony, seated together upon a barge adorned with silks and jewels, gazed upon their people reveling in joy. "Look," Cleopatra whispered, her hand entwined with his. "Tonight, Egypt remembers what it once was, eternal, unshaken, divine, and it is because of us." Antony, his face softened by the glow of torchlight, kissed her hand and replied, "Let Rome scorn us, let Octavian rage. Here we are not servants of their senate. We are rulers together." In that moment, as the river carried their barge beneath a canopy of stars, they felt invincible. Love had not only bound their hearts, but reshaped the world around them. But across the sea, in Rome's marble halls, Octavian listened to the reports with cold satisfaction. For the spectacle that filled Alexandria with joy would serve him well, as proof that Antony had forsaken Rome for a queen, and that war was now inevitable. In the marble silence of Rome, Octavian sat at his desk, reports from Alexandria scattered before him like weapons awaiting a master's hand. Each detail, Antony dressed as Dionysus, Cleopatra as Isis, Caesarion hailed as Caesar's son, and air was fuel for the fire he intended to set. Octavian understood Rome's heart. The Senate feared monarchs, despised queens, and mistrusted the East, and Antony, once their champion, now appeared in stories as a man enthralled not by Rome, but by a foreign enchantress. Octavian began to weave these truths and half-truths into a tale that would poison Antony's name at gatherings. Octavian whispered with quiet venom, "Antony has given away Roman provinces to his mistress. He raises her son, not a Roman, as heir to Caesar himself. He sits on a throne in Alexandria as if he were Pharaoh, drunk with power, drunk with lust." The words spread like wildfire. Pamphlets were distributed, speeches made, and even statues commissioned, showing Cleopatra leading Antony by the hand like a captive. The image struck deep. A Roman general enslaved by an Egyptian queen. Soon the streets of Rome murmured with disdain. Market sellers joked that Antony no longer spoke Latin but the tongue of Egypt. Housewives gossiped that Cleopatra had bewitched him with spells and potions. Senators nodded grimly, seeing not love but a threat to their republics. Dominion. Antony, far away in Alexandria, scoffed at these rumors when they reached him. He laughed with Cleopatra over Rome's hysteria, calling Octavian a coward, hiding behind words instead of steel. But Cleopatra, wiser to the power of reputation, grew uneasy. She had seen how swiftly words had condemned Caesar to death. One evening, as they reclined upon cushions in the golden hall, she spoke gravely. "Rome does not fight with swords alone, my love. Words can cut deeper, and Octavian knows how to wield them. Already he paints you not as a general, but as my shadow." Antony kissed her hand, dismissing her fears with warmth. "Let him speak. When the time comes, I will face him not in words, but in battle, and Rome will remember who I am." Cleopatra smiled, though her heart remained heavy. She loved him for his boldness, but she knew the world was shaped not only by battles won on fields, but also by stories told in marble cities. And Octavian, clever and patient, was already scripting the tale that would bring Rome to war. The rumors from Rome, though sharp and relentless, did not break the bond between Cleopatra and Antony. Instead, they seemed to draw the lovers closer, as if each insult hurled across the sea only deepened their determination to live, to rule, and to love as they pleased. In Alexandria, life glittered with brilliance. The couple surrounded themselves with poets, philosophers, musicians, and courtiers who adored them. Nights in the palace were drenched in music, lyres strumming soft melodies, flutes weaving notes into the scented air, dancers gliding across marble floors lit by torchlight. Cleopatra and Antony became the heart of these gatherings. They laughed freely, drank deeply, and played games of wit with their guests. But beyond the feasts, their intimacy was more profound than any rumor could capture. On evenings when the city slept, they sailed down the Nile together, their barge draped in silks and perfumed with incense, shimmered beneath the stars. Cleopatra reclined beneath a canopy of golden cloth, her dark hair catching the starlight, while Antony lay beside her, his voice softened by affection rather than command. "My queen," he whispered one night, his hand brushing hers, "they say you bewitched me. If so, never break the spell. For in your presence I am more alive than in any triumph Rome ever gave me." Cleopatra's lips curved into a smile. "No spell, my love, only truth. The truth that you and I were not meant to bow to the Senate's chains. We were meant to rule free." She leaned closer, her voice low, almost like the Nile itself, whispering, "Let Octavian rage, let Rome slander. Here, upon these waters, there is only us. In those quiet journeys, away from the echo of politics, they spoke of futures unclaimed, of their children growing together, of empires where East and West united, not in conquest, but in love's embrace. For a time, their dreams seemed stronger than Octavian's venom, yet Cleopatra, ever the strategist, never ignored the shadow of danger. Even as she laughed with Antony and held him close, she ordered her fleets prepared, her treasuries guarded, her alliances secured. Love filled her heart, but caution sharpened her mind, and so Alexandria thrived in defiance. While Rome whispered betrayal, the lovers chose splendor. While Octavian built war with words, Cleopatra and Antony built their own kingdom of joy, one kiss, one feast, one dream at a time. But beyond the Nile's gentle banks, Octavian's whispers hardened into steel. For in Rome the Senate prepared to declare war not upon Antony, but upon Cleopatra herself. In Rome's Senate, the air was heavy with incense and suspicion. Octavian stood tall before the gathered senators, his expression one of practiced outrage. Scrolls lay open in his hands, filled with reports of Antony's deeds in Alexandria. Provinces gifted to Cleopatra, Caesarion declared Caesar's heir. Feasts where Antony was no longer Roman, but a king of the East. He raised his voice so all could hear. Antony is no longer Rome's general. He has abandoned us, surrendered himself to a queen who seeks to sit beside him as mistress of the world. Rome cannot serve two masters, and we will not serve Cleopatra. The Senate stirred uneasily. Many had despised Antony's arrogance, but to declare war upon him directly risked dividing Rome. Octavian, shrewd as ever, offered them a cleaner path. "Let us not condemn Antony," he said, though his words dripped with calculation. "Let us condemn the foreign queen who has ensnared him." Let us declare war upon Cleopatra of Egypt. The chamber erupted in murmurs. By naming Cleopatra as Rome's enemy, Octavian cast Antony as her victim, a Roman ensnared rather than a traitor. It was a masterstroke of politics. Senators who might hesitate to strike down one of their own could unite against a queen. The vote was cast, the decision made. War was declared upon Cleopatra, and with it, Antony was forced into his truest choice, Rome or love. News traveled swiftly across the seas. In Alexandria, Cleopatra received the message in her palace chambers. She stood at her balcony, gazing over the harbor where her fleet lay anchored, sails folded like sleeping wings. So it had come to this. She had always known Rome's suspicion, had endured its venom, but now it was war, clear and final. And yet she felt no fear. Antony joined her there, his face shadowed by the weight of inevitability. He had heard, too. "Cleopatra," he said, his voice low. "They name you the enemy of Rome. But know this, where they see chains, I see freedom. I will not abandon you. If they come for you, they come for me." Her eyes softened, her hand brushing his cheek. "Then we will face them together. Our love has already defied kingdoms. Let it defy empires." Below, the waters of the Mediterranean shimmered in the evening light, as if waiting for the sails of war to rise. The lovers knew the path ahead would be perilous, yet their hearts were resolute, for love had led them this far, and love would carry them into the storm. The harbor of Alexandria stirred with restless energy. Ships groaned against their moorings, sails patched and readied oars stacked in neat rows. The scent of tar and salt filled the air as carpenters, sailors, and soldiers labored side by side, transforming Cleopatra's fleet into a weapon of destiny. From her balcony, overlooking the Pharos lighthouse, Cleopatra watched the preparations. The sea stretched before her, the same waters that had carried Caesar once and would now carry Antony to face Rome itself. She wore a robe of deep blue, her eyes fixed on the horizon, mind-weaving strategy, even as her heart beat for the man. At her side, Antony strode through the docks like a general reborn. He inspected ships, tested the discipline of soldiers, and shouted commands with the thunder of a man who had led armies to victory. Yet beneath the roar of command, his moments with Cleopatra revealed the tenderness of his heart. One evening, as they walked along the quiet quayside, Cleopatra spoke softly. "The Senate names me their enemy. But do you see, my love, what this means? This is no longer Rome's war against Antony. It is Rome against us." Antony stopped, taking her hands in his. His rough soldier's palms pressed against her softer ones, a contrast of iron and silk. "Then let them come. I chose this long ago, Cleopatra. I chose you. Rome thinks me broken, bewitched, but it is not weakness to love you. It is the only strength I need." Her eyes glistened, but her voice remained steady. "Then we must fight not only with love, but with fire. The fleet is readying. Egypt's wealth fills our coffers. We will stand as equals, side by side, against Octavian." Together they began to plan. Cleopatra ensured Egypt's ships were provisioned and her captains loyal. She secured alliances with Eastern kings, who sent men and gold in her name. Antony gathered his Roman veterans, men who still remembered his glories and believed in his strength, in the palace. Their children played in gardens of jasmine and myrtle, unaware of the tempest gathering. Cleopatra often paused at their laughter, her heart torn between the softness of motherhood and the steel of queenship. She kissed each child's brow at night, whispering blessings, knowing the future she built was not only for herself, but for them. And through it all, love bound her to Antony. In the council chamber, their voices rose in debate. On the terraces, by night, their whispers turned into vows. War loomed, yet their passion burned brighter, as if love itself was a torch they carried into the darkness. The harbor of Alexandria, once a place of trade, had become the forge of destiny. Ships gleamed, like armored swans, ready to carry queen and general alike into the storm that history would remember forever. Dawn spread across the Mediterranean, gilding the waters with light as Cleopatra's fleet stirred to life. The masts of her warships pierced the horizon, sails unfurling like wings, eager for flight. Painted prows gleamed with gold and bright pigments, some carved into the shapes of rams, others adorned with the symbols of Isis. The harbor of Alexandria, once a cradle of commerce and song, now thundered with drums of departure, vessel grand enough to rival a palace. Silk banners rippled in the sea breeze, their deep purple dyed to declare her sovereignty. Beside her, Antony wore armor polished to brilliance, his cloak crimson as a Roman sunrise. Together, they appeared less as queen and general, and more as gods returning to the sea, Isis and Dionysus reborn. The people of Alexandria crowded the shores to watch. Some wept, fearful of what the war would bring. Others raised their hands in prayer, invoking the Nile, the sun, and the gods to shield their queen. From the high walls of the city, priests cast offerings into the waters, lotus flowers, incense, and libations of wine. As the fleet pushed away from the harbor, the lovers shared a quiet moment at the stern. The sea, calm and endless, stretched before them like a path carved by fate. Antony's voice was steady, though shadows lingered in his eyes. "Cleopatra, we sail not only for power or for pride. We sail for us, for the life we have built, for the future we dare to dream. She touched his arm, her gaze soft but unyielding. And for our children, whatever comes, the world will know we lived as more than pawns of Rome. We lived as rulers, as lovers, as dreamers. Behind them, soldiers moved with precision, the beat of drums guiding the oarsmen as they dipped their oars into the sea in unison. The rhythmic splash echoed like a heartbeat, steady and unbroken. For days, the fleet glided across open waters. By night, the ships anchored under starlight, fires glowing upon the decks, laughter and songs drifting across the sea. Cleopatra walked among her sailors, offering words of courage. Antony trained his men, drilling them with a general's rigor. Yet, when the duties of day ended, they returned to each other, wrapped in the quiet of the night, whispering of love that seemed as vast as the ocean around them. But as the fleet neared the coast of Greece, the waters grew heavy with expectation. Scouts brought word of Octavian's navy, larger, leaner, disciplined by Agrippa, his trusted commander. The Roman fleet lay waiting near Actium, a narrow gulf where wind and tide could turn battles into legends. Cleopatra and Antony stood together at the prow, eyes fixed on the horizon where sails like storm clouds gathered. The hour was coming. Their love had carried them across years of joy and defiance, and now it would carry them into the greatest trial of all. The fleet of Cleopatra and Antony reached the rugged coast of Greece, where the Ionian Sea narrowed into the Gulf of Actium. The land rose in rocky slopes, its shores dotted with olive groves and sparse villages now emptied by the shadow of war. Ahead, the sea was no longer endless but confined, a stage where strategy would matter as much as strength. Octavian's fleet was already there. Under the command of Agrippa, his admiral, the Roman ships stretched like a wall across the gulfs. Entrance, sleek and swift, built for maneuver and speed, they contrasted with Cleopatra's larger, heavier vessels. To those who watched from the cliffs above, it seemed as if two worlds had gathered, east and west, poised to decide their fates upon the waves. Cleopatra anchored her flagship in the heart of the fleet. From its high deck, she could see Antony's command vessel nearby, bristling with armed men. She wore armor inlaid with gold, not to fight, but to inspire, her presence a beacon to her sailors. Her crown caught the sun, and even in the midst of war, she appeared every inch a queen. That night, as torches flickered along the decks, Antony came aboard her ship. He found her standing at the rail, watching the distant fires of Octavian camp burn against the horizon. It feels as though the world holds its breath, Cleopatra murmured. One battle, and all we have built hangs in the balance. Antony placed a hand over hers. I have fought 100 battles, but never one that meant so much. Not for Rome, not for honor, but for love. I will not let Octavian take you from me." She turned to him, her eyes fierce. "Then remember this, Antony. Win or lose, we stand together. Let history say what it will, that in the face of empire we chose love and fought for it." In the days that followed, the two lovers prepared their fleets with tireless devotion. Cleopatra moved among her captains, ensuring every ship had stores of grain, water, and weapons. She reminded her sailors that they fought not only for her crown, but for Egypt itself. Antony drilled his men with iron discipline, their chants echoing across the waters as they prepared for battle. Yet in the quiet hours, love softened the weight of command. They dined together on the deck, sharing bread and wine as the moon rose over the sea. They spoke of their children, of Alexandria's gardens, of nights on the Nile when the world seemed far away. Each word, each glance, was a vow against the coming storm, and still the horizon loomed with Octavian's waiting fleet. The calm before the storm stretched on, until the air itself seemed taut with destiny. Soon the silence would shatter. Soon Actium would decide not only their fate, but the fate of kingdoms. The morning of battle dawned with a strange stillness. The waters of the gulf reflected the pale sky, as though nature itself paused before the storm. On Cleopatra's flagship, sailors tightened ropes and adjusted sails, their faces etched with anticipation. From every ship in the fleet came the same sound, the sharpening of blades, the rhythm of drums, the steady breath of men and women preparing to gamble their lives on destiny. Antony's fleet lined the waters beside hers, massive ships with towering decks and heavy rams. Cleopatra's vessels gleamed with gilded prows, their banners fluttering in the rising breeze. Together, their navy stretched like a fortress upon the sea. Yet beyond them lay Octavian's forces, lighter and swifter, commanded with ruthless precision by Agrippa. At the sound of the war horns, the waters broke into fury. Roman oars cut the sea like knives, their ships advancing in tight formation. Antony's vessels surged forward to meet them, their oarsmen grunting in rhythm, rams crashing against enemy hulls. The clang of iron on iron echoed across the gulf, mingling with the cries of warriors and the crackle of fire arrows streaking the sky. Cleopatra stood tall on her deck, her crown gleaming in the sun. She did not hide within her cabin, but watched as her men fought bravely, her presence a living emblem of Egypt's pride. Messengers rushed to and from her side, bringing news of the battle's progress. Every command she gave was sharp, calm, steady, a queen unbroken. Even as the sea turned to chaos, Antony fought as he always had, at the front, where danger was fiercest. He moved among his ships, calling orders, rallying his men with a soldier's voice for Rome, for Egypt, for love. His words carried across the waters, and his men fought with the devotion of those who followed not just a general, but a man they trusted with their lives. Yet Agrippa's tactics proved cunning. His lighter ships encircled Antony's heavier ones, striking swiftly, retreating before they could be caught. Fires spread across the water as Roman missiles found their mark. The gulf that had seemed Antony's fortress began to feel like a trap. Cleopatra's eyes never left the chaos. Her heart pounded, torn between command and fear for Antony. For all their planning, all their love, she could see the tide shifting. Octavian's navy pressed harder, their advantage growing with each hour. Still, Cleopatra did not falter. She sent her fastest vessels to reinforce Antony, her captains straining to follow her orders. She whispered a prayer to Isis under her breath, not for victory alone, but for the man she loved above all else. Smoke curled into the sky, blotting out the sun. The sea roared with the crash of ships, the screams of men, the desperate struggle of two worlds colliding. And in the heart of it, Cleopatra and Antony stood defiant, their love alight amid the storm. But the tide of Actium had only begun to reveal its merciless hand. The battle raged into the midday sun, the Gulf of Actium churning with smoke and fury. Cleopatra's fleet fought valiantly, their gilded ships gleaming even amid fire and ruin. Yet Agrippa's cunning tactics were tightening like a noose. Lighter Roman vessels darted between Antony's slower warships, striking with precision and vanishing before counterattacks could land. On Cleopatra's flagship, the queen stood rooted at the stern, her hand clutching the rail as she watched the chaos unfold. The sea was a storm of broken masts, splintered oars, and the cries of the dying messengers rushed to her with reports, each one darker than the last. Supplies dwindling, formations breaking, Antony's ships encircled. Her heart battled with her mind. She had entered this war for love, for the survival of her crown, for the promise of a future shared with Antony. But as the tide shifted, a dreadful truth grew clear. The longer she stayed, the greater the risk, not only to her life, but to Egypt itself. If she fell, Alexandria would burn. If she lived, there might still be hope. The decision tore through her soul. She whispered to herself, for Egypt, for Antony. Then, with a trembling breath that became a command, she gave the order, raise the sails, break the line, we sail for open waters. The oarsmen obeyed. Her flagship surged forward, cutting through the smoke, its purple sails unfurling like a beacon in the chaos. One by one, her Egyptian ships followed, breaking free from the melee and fleeing toward the horizon. From his command vessel, Antony saw the movement. At first, Disbelief seized him. Cleopatra, his queen, his love, his anchor, was leaving the battle. His heart wrenched as he watched her sails vanish into the distance, purple banners whipping against the sky. For a moment, duty clashed with devotion. He could remain, fight, perhaps fall, a hero of Rome, even in defeat. But the thought of losing her, of letting her vanish into the horizon alone, was unbearable. Without hesitation, Antony leaped to his smaller galley, commanding it to follow Cleopatra's course. His officers shouted in protest, "General, the battle is not yet lost." But he silenced them with a single cry, "My place is with her." And so Antony abandoned the fight, chasing Cleopatra's sails into the open sea. Behind him, his fleet faltered, leaderless, morale broken. Octavian's navy closed in, turning retreat into ruin. The Battle of Actium, decided not by strength of arms, but by love's irresistible pull, slipped forever from Antony's grasp. As the sun dipped westward, the gulf lay littered with wreckage, Roman victory, undeniable, yet far beyond the smoke. Cleopatra's flagship sailed into the open waters, Antony by her side once more. They had escaped together, but at what cost? The sea was calmer once the roar of battle fell behind them. Cleopatra's flagship cut through open waters, its purple sails heavy with the weight of choice. Around it, her fleet streamed in disarray, battered, scorched, but free. Within her private cabin, Cleopatra sat upon a cushioned bench, her hands trembling, though her face remained composed. The cries of the dying still echoed in her ears. The sight of burning ships etched into her memory. She had acted to save Egypt, to preserve. What remained? But her heart whispered an unrelenting question. Had she doomed Antony? Then the door swung open. Antony entered, his armor scorched, his face darkened by smoke and sorrow. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. The air between them was thick with grief and unspoken accusations. Finally, Cleopatra rose. Her voice was soft, edged with dread. "You followed me." Antony's jaw clenched, his eyes burning with conflicting fires. "How could I not? When I saw your sails, I thought the world itself slipping away from me. What is Rome? What is victory if I lose you?" Tears shimmered in Cleopatra's eyes, though she held them back with queenly resolve. "I left for Egypt, for our children, for the crown. If I had fallen there, all would be lost. Alexandria would be the next Actium. I could not gamble the future on one doomed day." Antony's hand gripped the rail so tightly his knuckles whitened. "And yet, by leaving, the fleet fell apart. My men fought to the last, believing I stood with them, and I abandoned them." His voice broke, and for a moment the soldier who had commanded Rome's legions seemed more like a man broken by his heart. Cleopatra stepped closer, reaching for his hand. "No, Antony, you chose us. You chose love over empire. History will condemn us, perhaps, but history has never loved as we have." For a long silence, he stared at her, torn between anguish and devotion. Then, slowly, his shoulders softened. He drew her into his arms, resting his forehead against hers. "If the world must call me traitor, let it. I would rather be remembered as the man who chose Cleopatra that night." As their ship sailed southward toward Alexandria, the lovers dined together in silence. Wine sat untouched between them. Outside, the sailors whispered, wondering what the future would hold, whether their queen's choice had saved them or condemned them, all in the quiet of her chamber. Cleopatra traced the outline of Antony's hand, as if memorizing it against the darkness ahead. He lay beside her, awake, staring into nothing. The weight of Actium pressed down on them both, a wound not yet bled dry. Love had carried them from the flames, but as the stars wheeled above, neither could escape the truth. The empire they had dreamed of was slipping away, and soon the world would come for them again. The journey southward was long, the waters stretching endlessly as if time itself hesitated to bring them home. Cleopatra stood often upon the deck of her flagship, gazing toward the horizon, her purple cloak rippling in the sea wind. Alexandria awaited them, its golden lighthouse promising the sanctuary of familiar shores, yet also the burden of disappointed hopes. Antony paced restlessly. His armor was gone, replaced by a plain tunic, but the weight upon his shoulders seemed heavier than any breastplate. Each night he replayed the battle in his mind, the ramming of ships, the thunder of fire, the faces of men who had trusted him. Their voices haunted him more than the crash of Actium's waves. Cleopatra, ever watchful, saw the torment within him. She spoke gently, trying to soothe his restless spirit. "Antony, the war is not yet over. Rome is vast, but so is Egypt. Our city remains, our people remain, and I remain." Her words were like balm, yet he could not let go of guilt. But Octavian grows stronger with each heartbeat. He will not rest. He will tell Rome I fled for love, that I abandoned duty. He will call me traitor, unworthy of the name I once bore with pride. Cleopatra stepped closer, her gaze unflinching. "And what do you call yourself? A traitor, or a man who chose his heart over a hollow throne?" He said nothing, but his silence spoke louder than words. At last, after weeks at sea, the Alexandrian harbor came into view. The great Pharos lighthouse rose like a torch to the heavens, guiding them home. Crowds gathered upon the docks, their voices rising in a thunderous cheer as Cleopatra's gilded ship entered the harbor. To her people, she was still there, radiant. Queen, survivor of a storm that had swallowed lesser souls, Antony stood beside her as the people shouted her name. For a moment, he glimpsed what she always carried within her, an unshakable faith in image, in the power of presence. She knew that even in defeat, one could appear victorious. An appearance often commanded loyalty as surely as truth. That night, the royal court welcomed them with feasts and music. The walls glittered with golden light, yet beneath the revelry lay unease. Courtiers bowed, smiled, praised their queen and her Roman consort, but whispers rustled in shadowed corners. News of Actium traveled faster than sails, and many wondered whether Egypt's glory could endure against Octavian's rising. Cleopatra held Antony's hand through the celebration, her grip unyielding. She laughed, she danced, she reassured her people with poise and majesty. Yet in her heart she knew the truth. The Nile's waters had brought them home, but Rome's tide was still coming, and when the banquet ended and they retreated to the quiet of the palace, Cleopatra turned to Antony and whispered, "Whatever comes, we face it together. If the gods decree our fall, let it be as one." Antony kissed her forehead, his voice breaking. Then let history write of a queen and a soldier who loved more fiercely than they feared the world. The palace at Alexandria welcomed them like a sanctuary of marble and gold. Columns gleamed in the torchlight, fountains murmured with cool waters, and the scent of lotus blossoms drifted on the air. Yet beneath the splendor lingered an uneasy stillness, as though the city itself held its breath. Cleopatra wasted no time. She adorned her halls with splendor greater than before, as if to dazzle away the whispers of Actium. Banquets resumed, processions filled the streets, and the queen herself appeared radiant, her gowns shimmering with jewels, her head crowned with the golden uraeus of Egypt. She projected triumph, even as the taste of defeat still clung to memory. Antony, however, struggled to reconcile his heart with his spirit. In public, he smiled at Cleopatra's side, raising cups of wine, listening to the music of lyres. But when the feasts ended, he often withdrew into silence. The loss of his legions weighed on him. In his mind, every laugh in the banquet hall echoed with the ghost of soldiers left behind at a CTIUM. Cleopatra saw his turmoil and sought to draw him back into life. One evening, she invited him to join her in the palace gardens. Lanterns flickered among olive trees, and the Nile glistened beyond the walls. She leaned close, her voice soft but unyielding. "You are not only a Roman general, Antony. You are the man I chose above all. Egypt has given you a throne, a home, and a love the Senate could never offer. Do not let the past consume you. Our present is still ours to shape. He looked at her, the lines of grief etched deeply into his face, and for the first time since the battle, his lips curved into a faint smile. "You remind me," he whispered, "that even when the world calls me broken, you call me whole." That night, the lovers dined not in the great hall, but in a small chamber filled with roses. Cleopatra poured wine herself, feeding him figs and honeyed dates with her hands. Their laughter was quieter than before, touched with fragility, yet it was real. In those hours, Rome's shadow seemed distant, the war forgotten, as if the Nile itself carried them into a world meant for only two. But outside the palace walls, news grew darker each day. Octavian tightened his grip over Rome. His generals advanced slowly, steadily, preparing for Egypt as their final prize. Whispers reached Alexandria, rumors of betrayal among Antony's allies, defections, secret negotiations with Rome. Still, Cleopatra held firm. To her, every moment with Antony was both a victory and a farewell, the kind of love that knew it might not last, and so burned brighter for it. And in the stillness of the night, as Antony slept beside her, she lay awake, staring at the painted ceiling of her chamber. She knew the gods had granted them this fragile reprieve, but she also knew the storm was not over. It was only gathering beyond the horizon. In the golden halls of Alexandria, Cleopatra and Antony worked tirelessly to restore what Actium had torn apart. Letters were dispatched across the seas, messengers sent to old allies, promises written in flowing ink. The queen's scribes bent over scrolls day and night, carrying her words to kings and client rulers who once had stood beneath Antony's banner. But responses came back slowly, many tinged with hesitation. Some rulers pleaded poverty after years of war. Others excused themselves with vague promises, and more than a few simply did not answer at all. Rome's shadow frightened them. Octavian's victories had made loyalty to Antony costly. Antony saw this and fell into silence, pacing the marble floors of the palace colonnade. "They turn from me," he muttered one evening, his voice hoarse with bitterness. "The same kings who once bent the knee now look to Octavian. They smell defeat on me, Cleopatra." Cleopatra, seated upon a carved throne of ebony and ivory, did not flinch. "Then let them betray themselves. Egypt does not bow to Rome. We still command the Nile's wealth, the granaries that feed empires, and I still command the loyalty of my people. You are not alone, Antony. You have me." Her eyes caught his, steady and blazing with conviction. It was in moments like this that Antony remembered why he had left Rome's cold marble for the warmth of Alexandria. Here he was not merely a general, bound by senatorial decrees. He was a king beside a queen who believed in him, even when the world would not taught to strengthen their image. Cleopatra arranged a series of public ceremonies. Together, she and Antony appeared in splendid robes before the crowds. In the great court, they sat upon twin thrones, presenting themselves as the rulers of the East, sovereigns of Egypt, Syria, and beyond. Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, was brought forward, robed in white and gold, proclaimed King of Kings. The people cheered, voices rising in a chorus that echoed through the city streets. For a time, hope flickered anew. Alexandria glowed with music, parades, and sacrifices to the gods. Ships were repaired, soldiers drilled again, and coins were minted bearing the faces of Cleopatra and Antony side by side. But Antony knew, as did Cleopatra, that hope was fragile. Octavian's agents spread rumors in every port, tales of Antony, bewitched Antony, enslaved by an Egyptian queen, Antony betraying Roman honor for Eastern luxury. The Senate in Rome declared him an enemy, and with each passing month, the circle around Egypt tightened. Yet, within the palace walls, love refused to falter. In the evenings, when the weight of empire pressed too heavily upon Antony's chest, Cleopatra would draw him into her chambers, away from maps and messengers. There she would remind him, not with words, but with touch, that he was more than the titles Rome could strip away. And as Antony's laughter slowly returned, Cleopatra whispered to herself a vow. If Rome sought to tear him down, she would be the fortress that held him up, even if it meant standing against the whole empire. Cleopatra knew the power of spectacle. If their allies faltered, then she would give Alexandria and the world a vision of majesty too dazzling to deny. So the city became a stage, and she and Antony its shining stars. Great festivals unfurled across the capital. Processions wound through the streets with golden chariots, dancers clad in silks, and musicians filling the air with cymbals and flutes. Cleopatra rode high upon a throne set upon a gilded barge, her headdress glittering with emeralds. Antony stood beside her, in Roman armor polished to a mirror sheen, a garland upon his brow. Together they looked not as fugitives of Actium, but as rulers destined to command both Nile and Tiber. In the palace, Cleopatra prepared banquets that rivaled Olympus itself. The halls were perfumed with frankincense and myrrh, the tables spread with delicacies from every corner of her kingdom. Figs from Syene, fish from the Red Sea, wine from the Delta. Musicians played while servants poured endless cups of red wine into golden goblets. Antony, drawn into her world of luxury and grace, found his spirit lifting, for within these walls, defeat seemed unthinkable. One night, at Cleopatra's command, the palace was transformed into a dream of the heavens. Lanterns, painted with constellations, hung from the ceiling, and silken curtains in deep blue and silver billowed in the breeze. She entered, dressed as the goddess Isis, her gown flowing like moonlight, and Antony, crowned in ivy, appeared as Dionysus, lord of wine and triumph. Together they danced before their court, gods walking among mortals, their love declared not in whispers but in spectacle. The courtiers cheered, intoxicated by the vision. For a time, all Alexandria believed that fortune favored its queen and her Roman consort. Yet Cleopatra's brilliance was more than vanity. She knew well that the appearance of strength could buy loyalty, could steady trembling allies, could remind Antony himself that he was more than a broken general. He was still a man chosen by destiny, chosen by her. But Antony, though he smiled, felt the hollowness at times. The festivals glittered, yet he knew Octavian's legions marched closer with every passing moon. He confessed his fear to Cleopatra one quiet evening after the revels ended. "What if all this vanishes?" he asked, staring at the flicker of a single lamp. "What if Rome tears down these walls, scatters these people, silences our names?" Cleopatra touched his cheek, her eyes unwavering. "Then let Rome come. They may shatter stone, but they cannot erase love. What we have built, not just palaces, but a bond between hearts, will outlive their empire." Her words sank into him like a balm, softening the ache of failure. And for that night he let himself believe. Far to the west, in the heart of Rome, Octavian prepared for his final conquest. The Senate hailed him as savior. Statues of his likeness rose in the Forum, and the legions pledged their loyalty with unshakable discipline. Unlike Antony, Octavian fought not with passion but with patience, every step calculated, every promise binding men closer to his cause. When news of his preparations reached Alexandria, Antony and Cleopatra listened in silence. Reports told of ships rebuilt, stronger than before, armies swelling with recruits, and provinces falling in line under Octavian's banner. The Mediterranean, once Antony's domain, now bowed to his rival. Cleopatra, ever the strategist, urged, "Caution, we cannot meet him in open battle, not yet. The Nile is our strength, our walls are our shield. Let him come to us, and Egypt will prove an enemy Rome cannot so easily devour." But Antony, restless and proud, bristled. "I will not cower behind walls. I am Marcus Antonius, who rode with Caesar, who conquered Gaul, who stood unbroken even when Rome turned its back. Octavian is no more than a boy propped up by politics." Cleopatra placed her hand over his, steady and cool. Even Caesar was undone when pride clouded his judgment. Listen to me, beloved. The Nile has patience, and patience wins empires. For days, the palace seemed divided between their wills, Cleopatra's caution and Antony's hunger for redemption. Courtiers whispered in corridors, soldiers awaited orders, and merchants wondered whether to hoard grain or send it abroad. Yet amid the uncertainty, their bond deepened. Each evening, after the weight of command had worn them thin, they sought each other's company. Cleopatra read to Antony from papyrus scrolls tales of ancient pharaohs, of gods who rose and fell, yet left their names forever etched in stone. He, in turn, recounted memories of Caesar, of campaigns in the frozen north, of moments when the world had felt conquerable. One night, Antony confessed softly, "Cleopatra, if Rome should take me, promise you will endure. You must live for Caesarion, for Egypt, for all you have built." Her eyes shimmered in the lamplight. "Do not speak of endings. We will write a story Rome cannot erase. And if fate denies us victory, then let it at least grant us a love greater than triumph." Outside their chamber, the city of Alexandria remained restless. The people prayed at temples, ships gathered in harbors, soldiers patrolled by torchlight. The Nile, timeless and silent, flowed on, bearing witness to an empire poised between glory and ruin. And across the sea, Octavian's sails had already begun to turn toward Egypt. The summer heat pressed heavy over Alexandria, yet the city trembled not from the sun but from the whispers of war. Octavian's legions had crossed the Aegean, their sails blotting out the horizon. Every day brought fresh news of towns subdued, of provinces bending their knee, of roads cleared for the steady march toward Egypt. Antony summoned his generals in the great hall. Maps were spread across a marble table, lit by the flicker of oil lamps. He struck the surface with his fist, voice ringing like steel. "We will meet him before he sets foot in Alexandria. The Nile is our ally. Its channels and marshes will choke his legions. He thinks us broken, but he will find Rome humbled at Egypt's gates." The men nodded, though their eyes betrayed unease. They had seen what had become of Antony's forces after Actium. Still, Cleopatra stood at his side, her presence like a crown of certainty. She lifted her chin and said clearly, "Egypt does not falter. Our gods watch over us, and our people stand firm. Let Rome remember, the Nile has swallowed invaders before." That night, Alexandria roared with activity. Shipwrights hammered in the harbors, fashioning vessels for river defense. Soldiers lined the palace courtyards, drilling until sweat poured from their brows. Women wove banners, priests offered sacrifices, and merchants stocked the granaries with grain for siege. Cleopatra walked among her people, clad in robes of white linen, speaking softly to the crowds. Her words carried like music, promises of protection, of resilience, of Egypt's eternal strength. Antony, watching from a balcony, marveled at her. She was not simply a queen. She was Egypt itself, the Nile embodied in flesh and spirit. His heart ached with pride and dread, knowing that the fate of both their lives and their kingdoms balanced upon the choices of these final days. Later, in the quiet of the palace gardens, he confessed to her what his soldiers would never hear. Cleopatra, if Octavian overwhelms us, I will not be dragged through the streets of Rome as a trophy. Better to fall with a sword in hand. She took his hand in hers, firm and unyielding. Then, if you fall, I fall. Do you think I would let Rome display me as their captive queen? No, we will write the end together, if it must come to that. But until the last breath, we fight. The moonlight bathed them both as they sealed this vow in silence. Around them, the garden's fountains murmured, indifferent to the destiny. Closing in, and upon the sea, Octavian's fleet pressed onward, the rhythm of oars carrying Rome ever closer to the heart of Egypt. The dawn broke heavy with dust as Octavian's legions crossed into Egypt. Endless lines of soldiers marched beneath scarlet banners, their armor glinting like fire in the sun. War horns echoed across the desert plains, carried on the wind toward Alexandria. For the first time, the kingdom of the Nile felt the iron weight of Rome's advance pressing at its borders. Messengers raced to the palace. Antony, armored and resolute, met them in the council chamber. The news was grim. Egypt's gateway fortress had fallen with little resistance. Some whispered betrayal, others fear, but Antony silenced them with a raised hand. If Pelusium falters, Alexandria must not. We hold the heart, and the heart is unbreakable. Cleopatra stood beside him, her presence unshaken. She wore a golden diadem crowned with the serpent Urius, its jeweled eyes glimmering as if alive. Her voice was calm, carrying authority that stilled the chamber. Rome may march upon our sands, but Egypt does not yield. We will gather the fleet upon the Nile. We will fortify our city. And should Octavian think us weak, let him taste the fury of a people who defend their queen. In the harbors, warships creaked as they were drawn into position. Their sails dyed crimson and blue. Archers practiced until their fingers bled, while the streets filled with the sound of hammer and forge. The temples, too, resounded with chants and prayers offerings to Isis, Horus, and Ra, asking that the gods shield Egypt in its hour of peril. Yet beneath the fervor unease simmered. Many remembered Actium's ruin and Rome's reputation for inevitability. weighed heavily upon their hearts. Cleopatra saw it in the eyes of her people, the shadow of doubt. So she moved among them with the grace of a goddess, her voice soft as the Nile's current. "My children," she told them, lifting a child into her arms before the gathered crowd. "Rome believes it can silence us, but Egypt is eternal. The Nile does not bow. We will endure, for I endure with you." The crowd roared, renewed with fervor. For a time, fear loosened its grip, replaced by a tide of loyalty. That night, as Antony and Cleopatra stood together on the palace walls, they gazed at the horizon where fires marked Octavian's encampments. Antony clenched his jaw. "He is close now. There will be no turning back." Cleopatra's hand found his. "Then let the world witness what love can defy. If we are to fall, let us fall as rulers, not as shadows." The torches of Rome flickered in the distance, a sea of stars, advancing across Egypt's sand. The storm was at hand. The morning sun rose red, painting the Nile like spilled blood. Along its banks, Antony's forces gathered, shields braced and spears gleaming. The war cries of Egyptians mingled with the disciplined chants of Roman veterans who had once followed him, but now marched beneath Octavian's command. Fate had brought Antony to stand against the very machine he once commanded. The battlefield stretched wide, sand mixing with reeds along the river. Cleopatra's fleet waited upon the waters, sails furled and ready to strike should Octavian ships press too close. From the deck of her flagship she watched with fierce calm, adorned in a flowing gown of white linen, the golden sun disk of Isis upon her brow. Her presence alone steeled the sailors' hearts, for to them she was no mere queen. She was Egypt's very soul. Antony rode before his lines upon a white horse, his voice booming like thunder. "Today, Rome comes not for me, but for Egypt, for your homes, for your children, for your queen. Stand firm, and let Octavian know that the Nile cannot be chained." The soldiers roared, striking their spears against their shields until the earth trembled. Across the field, banners unfurled, crimson eagles gleaming in the sunlight. His legions advanced with the cold precision of a tide that had swallowed nations when the first clash came. It was like the sky splitting apart. Arrows darkened the heavens, swords rang against shields, and cries of valor and pain filled the air. Antony threw himself into the fray with the fury of a man fighting not for empire, but for love. His blade cut a path through the legionnaires, his armor soaked in sweat and dust, his presence a beacon for his men. From her ship, Cleopatra watched the battle unfold. Her heart beat with equal parts terror and pride. Every time Antony's standard wavered, she saw him drive forward again, his strength unyielding. Yet she also saw the discipline of Rome pressing back, line after line, like waves battering against stone. The Nile mirrored the chaos. Its waters churned as ships maneuvered, some aflame, others clashing with oars and rams. The cries of sailors joined the din of battle, the river itself bearing witness to the struggle for Egypt's soul. Hours passed, and the field became a storm of dust and blood. Antony fought tirelessly, but he could not ignore the sheer scale of Octavian's might. For every Roman soldier cut down, another stepped forward, relentless and silent. Still, when night fell and the horns called both armies back, Alexandria still stood. Antony's forces bloodied but unbroken, Cleopatra's fleet battered but afloat. The Nile ran red under the moonlight, and the stars looked down upon a world balanced upon the edge of destiny. In the quiet after the clash, Antony returned to Cleopatra's side. Exhaustion weighed upon him, yet when he saw her waiting on the deck, her gaze fierce and unwavering, he felt his spirit ignite once more. "We held," he whispered, voice hoarse. She pressed her hand to his cheek. "And as long as we stand together, we will hold again." The night after the battle, Alexandria seemed to breathe again. Fires were lit in the streets, soldiers lifted cups of wine, and songs echoed from the taverns. The people cheered their queen and her Roman general, believing that the Nile's strength had turned back Octavian's legions. Yet, behind the palace walls, Cleopatra and Antony knew the truth. The battle had been but a single wave in a storm far greater than Egypt's shores could withstand. Octavian's forces were vast, disciplined and relentless. For every ship lost, Rome sent 2 more. For every legionnaire slain, replacements marched from the horizon in the council chamber. Maps were unrolled, showing the Mediterranean choked with Octavian's fleets. His generals tightened their noose, cutting Egypt off from allies and trade. One advisor whispered, "The grain ships cannot reach us. Supplies dwindle. If this continues, Alexandria will starve." Antony slammed his fist against the marble table, the sound cracking like thunder. "Then we strike again before they can choke us. We will not wait to wither behind walls." Cleopatra.com, though weariness pulled at her eyes, placed her hand upon his arm. "And yet each strike bleeds us further, while Octavian grows stronger. My love, Egypt is mighty, but Rome is endless." He turned to her, pain etched deep into his face. "I cannot bear to see them march you in chains through Rome's streets, paraded as a captive queen." Her gaze sharpened. "Then you will not. I am not a jewel for Octavian's triumph. If Rome seeks to bind me, I will write my own ending." Words hung heavy between them, unsaid yet understood. Both knew what fate awaited if they fell into Octavian's hands. Outside, the city strained under the weight of fear. Bread grew scarce, prices soared, and whispers spread that the gods had abandoned Egypt. Yet still Cleopatra walked the markets in plain linen, speaking softly to her people. She reminded them of their heritage, of the Nile's eternal cycle, of Egypt's pride. Mothers wept at her words, children clutched her robes, and men found renewed courage in her steady presence. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Antony and Cleopatra stood upon the palace balcony overlooking the sea. Octavian's ships dotted the water like black stones, hemming in the harbor. The queen leaned against Antony's shoulder, her voice low. "Do you remember the night in Tarsus, when I sailed to you upon the Cydnus? The river glittered, and you swore the world itself could stop, and we would not notice." Antony smiled faintly, his eyes distant. I thought then that no force under the heavens could part us. And though Rome may press its hand upon us, still I believe it. Their fingers intertwined, gripping not in triumph, but in defiance. Love had carried them through battles, through betrayals, through the turning of empires. And though Octavian's shadow grew longer by the day, their bond stood like a flame against the gathering dark. The night carried a chill, and from the sea came the faint rhythm of Roman oars. The storm had not passed, it had only just begun. Dawn crept over Alexandria, but the city awoke not to songbirds, but to the sound of war drums. From the palace towers, Cleopatra and Antony could see Octavian's legions assembling like an iron tide. Siege engines were rolled into place, their wheels groaning over stone. Towers of wood bristling with archers creaked forward, and catapults stretched their ropes like predators ready to strike. The city trembled as the first stones hurled from Roman engines slammed into the walls. Dust and fragments rained upon the defenders, yet they held firm, manning the battlements with arrows and oil. The harbor echoed with battle cries as Octavian's ships pressed in, their rams smashing against Egypt's fleet. Cleopatra's captains fought valiantly, their sails burning gold in the morning sun. But the sheer weight of Rome pressed them back, inch by inch. Inside the city, the people huddled in prayer. Temples filled with incense and chants rose like smoke toward the heavens. Priests begged the gods to protect their queen, while mothers clutched children close, ears ringing with the thunder of war beyond the walls. Antony rode along the ramparts, his voice strong, rallying weary soldiers. His armor bore scars from countless battles, yet his spirit shone unbroken. "Hold," he shouted, lifting his sword to the sky. "This is Alexandria, the jewel of the world. Let no Roman foot claim her stones." And for a time they did hold, Arrows blazed from the walls, boiling oil poured down upon ladders, and Cleopatra's fleet struck back with cunning maneuvers. She herself moved through the palace, tending to the wounded, offering words that carried more strength than medicine. "You bleed for Egypt," she whispered to a soldier as she bound his wound, "and Egypt will remember." But as the days stretched on, supplies dwindled, and Rome's engines never ceased. Walls cracked beneath the relentless pounding flames, licked across rooftops, and the Nile itself ran with ash and oil. One evening, Antony returned to the palace, dust and blood upon him, his eyes shadowed. Cleopatra met him in the Hall of Columns, where torchlight flickered upon the painted gods. "They press harder," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "Each day our lines shrink. Octavian will not rest until he has you, alive or dead." Cleopatra's gaze was steady. "Then he shall have neither." He paused, searching her eyes, and for a moment the world outside the palace walls disappeared. "If this is to be our end, then let us meet it together. Not as captives, but as sovereigns, as lovers." She placed her hand against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "Together," she whispered. Outside, the roar of Rome shook the night. The siege tightened, and Alexandria, once the beacon of knowledge and splendor, stood on the brink of ruin. The lovers knew the sands of time had nearly run dry. As the siege dragged on, the walls of Alexandria groaned with every strike, and the people's faith faltered. What began as a proud defense turned to whispers in the marketplaces and secret dealings in the night. Hunger gnawed at the city. Bread vanished, oil grew scarce, and children cried for food that could no longer be found. Octavian's envoys, sly as serpents, found their way into the city through hidden gates and bribed hands. They carried promises of pardon, of safety, of wealth, for those who would yield. Among the weary, these whispers took root. Some officers of Antony's army, once bold, began to question whether their loyalty was worth ruin. One night, as the moon rose silver over the Nile, Antony discovered treachery. A trusted captain who had fought at his side for years was caught sending a message to Octavian's camp. Dragged before him in chains, the man fell to his knees, tears streaking through the dust on his cheeks. "My lord," the captain begged, "Rome is endless. We cannot stand against it. Yield, and your life may yet be spared." Antony's fury was terrible. He drew his sword, but it was not rage alone that shook his hand. It was sorrow. "Spared," he thundered, "spared to crawl in chains before Octavian. Spared to watch Cleopatra paraded through Rome." With a swift strike, he ended the traitor's life, and his men watched in grim silence. Cleopatra heard of this and sought Antony in the palace gardens, where the lotus flowers still bloomed. untouched by war. She found him there, kneeling by the pool, his hands stained with blood, his spirit heavy. "They are breaking, Cleopatra," he confessed, his voice ragged. "Not from Rome's strength alone, but from hunger, from fear. I can fight an army, but how do I fight despair in the hearts of my own men?" She knelt beside him, her hand upon his shoulder. "You cannot fight despair with a sword, my love, but you can with hope. You are their shield, their fire. While you stand, they will believe." Her words lit a spark within him, though the weight upon his soul remained. He kissed her hand, pressing it to his brow. "Then I will stand. Until the very end, I will stand." That night, the city held its breath. Fires burned on the ramparts. Soldiers whispered prayers to gods both Roman and Egyptian, and lovers clung together as if the dawn might never come. Beyond the walls, Octavian's army waited, patient as death, their torches glowing like a field of stars. Within the palace, Antony and Cleopatra lay awake, their hands entwined. Betrayal had struck, despair had grown, but their bond, fragile, yet unbroken, remained the only light that kept the shadows at bay. The siege pressed on, each day draining Alexandria of strength and spirit. Yet Antony still clung to hope, his faith resting on Cleopatra's presence and the loyalty of a few steadfast men. But fate is not gentle with lovers who defy empires. One morning, as Antony prepared his troops for another skirmish near the harbor, a messenger stumbled into his camp. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he fell at Antony's feet. "My lord," the man gasped, the queen is dead." The words struck like a blade through Antony's chest. His knees weakened, and his vision swam. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to fall silent, the roar of Rome and the cries of his soldiers fading into nothing. Cleopatra gone, his anchor, his flame, his very reason to fight. He dismissed the soldiers who crowded around him, retreating into his tent where shadows cloaked his grief. Alone, he pressed his hands to his face, his mind unraveling. Images of her flooded him. The first moment he saw her upon the golden barge. At Tarsus, the nights beneath Alexandria's stars, the warmth of her hand in his. And now, all gone, snatched by the cruelty of war. "They have taken her from me," he whispered to the empty air. "What is left? What is life when she is no more?" His despair deepened into a terrible resolve. If Cleopatra had fallen, then he would not outlive her. He called for his most trusted servant, Eros, who had sworn never to let his master be taken alive by Rome. "Eros," Antony said, his voice hollow yet firm, "the time has come. Do what you swore. Strike the blow before Octavian can bind me in chains." But Eros, faithful to the end, could not raise his sword against the man he loved as lord and brother. Instead, with tears streaming, he turned the blade upon himself, falling dead at Antony's feet. Antony staggered back in horror, yet in that moment his course was sealed. Gripping his own sword, he raised it high, and with one final cry, he thrust it deep into his own body. The pain was searing, but it could not drown the greater agony of his heart. Yet fate, cruel and twisting, spared him immediate death. Bleeding, staggering, he learned the truth too late. Cleopatra was not dead. The news had been false, a ruse carried by whispers and shadows. Word came that she still lived, hidden in the mausoleum she had prepared for herself, awaiting her final hour. Antony's breath faltered as soldiers carried him through the streets, his lifeblood staining the stones of Alexandria. The city wailed at the sight, their great general, broken not by Rome, but by love and despair. "Take me to her," he whispered, his voice faint as a dying flame. "Let me see my queen once more." And so Antony was borne toward the mausoleum to meet Cleopatra in the twilight of their story. The palace was hushed as Antony's broken body was carried through its halls, each step leaving a trail of blood upon marble floors once polished for triumph. His soldiers, worn and weeping, bore him with reverence, knowing this was not only the fall of a man, but the end of an age. Cleopatra waited in her mausoleum, a place she had prepared, not as a shrine of the dead, but as a final act of defiance, a sanctuary against Rome's triumph. Draped in white linen, she leaned against a gilded couch, her eyes hollow, yet burning with desperate hope. When the heavy doors creaked open, and she saw Antony's form, pale and lifeless in the arms of his men, she rose with a cry that pierced stone. "Antony!" Her voice trembled through the chamber. The soldiers lowered him gently, and with what strength remained, Antony lifted his head to see her face. His lips curved into a faint smile, though blood stained his teeth. "My queen," he whispered, voice cracked and frail, "you live. Thank the gods, you live." Cleopatra fell beside him, cradling his head upon her lap, her tears falling freely upon his cheeks. Her hands trembled as she touched his wounds, knowing no salve could mend them. "I was told you were gone," Antony murmured, "and so I sought to follow." His breath hitched, every word a battle. "Forgive me, beloved. I could not imagine a world without you." Cleopatra pressed her lips to his forehead, her sobs shaking her slender frame. "There is nothing to forgive. You are my heart, Antony, my light in darkness. No empire can tear that away." Around them the chamber fell silent, save for the faint echo of Rome battering the city outside. To Cleopatra, none of it mattered. Time itself seemed to stop. leaving only the two of them bound together in their last moments. Antony's hand, trembling and weak, sought hers. He pressed her fingers to his lips, leaving the faintest kiss upon her skin. "Do not yield to him," he said, his gaze fixed upon her eyes. "Octavian, he will drag you in chains through Rome. Promise me you will not give him that victory." She nodded, her face fierce through the tears. "I promise. Egypt shall not bow. I will meet death as a queen." Relief flickered. He drew one final breath, and with it he whispered the words that had bound them from the first, together forever. His hand slipped from hers, his chest stilled, and in Cleopatra's arms, Mark Antony, warrior, general, and lover, passed into eternity. The queen bowed over him, her cries echoing through the mausoleum like a prayer to the gods. She kissed his lips, cold and still, and whispered, "I will not be long, my love." Outside, Rome's victory drew closer, but within those walls, Cleopatra and Antony had won their own, a love unbroken by fate, sealed forever in tragedy. The death of Antony left Cleopatra in a silence deeper than grief. For hours, she remained at his side, stroking his hair, whispering to him as though her words could call him back from the veil. But when the last echo of his breath faded, her mourning transformed into resolve. News of Antony's death raced through Alexandria like fire through dry reeds. Some wept, others despaired, and many felt their last hope extinguished. Yet Octavian rejoiced. His messengers proclaimed victory even before the gates had fallen, for the heart of the resistance was gone. Soon, Octavian's forces breached the city, their banners unfurled against the dawn. The streets that had once flourished with trade and music now lay silent, lined with faces that dared not resist. And in her mausoleum, Cleopatra prepared herself for the inevitable encounter with Rome's young conqueror. Octavian entered, not as a raging conqueror, but as a man cloaked in cold restraint. He was calm, deliberate, his eyes sharp with calculation. He found Cleopatra seated upon her golden throne, her face pale with sorrow, but her bearing regal. Even in despair, she was every inch a queen. "Cleopatra," he said, his tone measured, "Rome has triumphed. Antony is dead, and Egypt is mine. But if you surrender, I will show you mercy. You will live, though not as a queen, but as a captive. You will walk in my triumph through Rome, and the world will see Egypt bow before me." The words cut deep, but Cleopatra's gaze never faltered. She knew what awaited her if she yielded: humiliation, chains, and the loss of all dignity. To be paraded through foreign streets as a trophy was a fate worse than death. "You speak of mercy," she replied, her voice steady as the Nile, "but it is not mercy to strip a queen of her crown and soul. You may have Egypt's walls, Octavian, but you will never have my spirit. Octavian, though outwardly composed, was unsettled by her defiance. He saw in her not a broken woman, but a sovereign who would rather embrace death than yield. He urged his guards to keep close watch over her, fearing she might rob him of his prize by taking her own life. Cleopatra, however, had already chosen her path. She returned to her chamber, her eyes fixed upon Antony's still form. She whispered to him as if he could hear her voice, both tender and fierce. They will not chain me, my love. I will join you soon, and in death we shall be free. Around her, loyal attendants wept, but they did not hinder her. They knew their queen's spirit, and they too despised the thought of Roman chains. Together they began to weave the quiet, deliberate plan for her final act of defiance. Outside, Octavian tightened his grip upon the city, believing victory was complete. But within her guarded chamber, Cleopatra prepared to write the last line of her own story, one that Rome itself would never erase. The mausoleum grew still in the hours after Octavian's departure. Cleopatra sat beside Antony's lifeless body, her fingers gently tracing the curve of his face, her lips whispering vows into silence. Around her, the air was thick with grief. But beneath the grief stirred an unyielding flame. She would not be dragged to Rome in chains. She would meet Antony beyond the veil as a queen, not a captive. Her attendants, Iras and Charmian, watched closely, their faces drawn with sorrow. But resolute, they had served her through triumph and loss, and now they would follow her into the shadows. Cleopatra gathered them close, her voice hushed but fierce. Octavian thinks he has claimed me, she said, her eyes glinting with fire. But Egypt's queen does not live for Rome's amusement. Tonight, we choose our own ending. Tonight, I will join Antony. Charmian, ever practical, asked how such a fate could be secured while Rome's guards lingered at the gates. Cleopatra's gaze shifted to a basket in the corner of the chamber, a simple basket, woven of reeds, adorned with figs and greenery, but nestled within, hidden from prying eyes, coiled Egypt's oldest symbol of sovereignty and death, the sacred asp. Life has left me little choice, Cleopatra whispered, but in the serpent's kiss I will find freedom. It is Egypt's gift, a final triumph. Iris wept softly, but nodded, her loyalty unbroken. If this is your will, my queen, then I will not leave your side. As the night deepened, Cleopatra bathed and clothed herself in regal finery, not the garments of mourning, but the robes of majesty. She adorned herself with the diadem of Isis, jewels glimmering like starlight. Her beauty, though heavy with sorrow, shone with a radiance that even death could not dim. She sat upon her couch, reclining with the grace of a goddess, and ordered the basket of figs to be brought forth. With trembling hands she parted the leaves, and the serpent stirred, its scales glinting in the lamplight. A shiver passed through the attendants, but Cleopatra's expression was serene. She reached out, her fingers steady, and spoke in a voice soft yet commanding. "Come, sweet messenger, carry me to him." The asp struck swiftly, its fangs delivering the venom of eternity. Cleopatra gasped, but her face softened, as though pain itself yielded before her will. She laid back upon her couch, her body sinking into stillness, her eyes fixed upon Antony's form. A faint smile touched her lips. Beside her, Iras and Charmian also embraced the serpent's gift, choosing loyalty in death as they had in life. The chamber grew silent, save for the soft flicker of the oil lamps, until, at last, the queen's breath slowed and ceased. Cleopatra, last pharaoh of Egypt, had claimed her freedom, not by Rome's decree, but by her own hand. When guards finally forced their way inside, they found her lying in majesty, adorned as Isis incarnate, Antony beside her. The conqueror had won Egypt, but Cleopatra had won eternity. Dawn broke over Alexandria, its light muted by the smoke of conquest. Octavian's soldiers pressed through the city, their banners raised, their boots echoing against once-proud streets. Victory was theirs, yet the heart of the queen's palace lay strangely silent. When Octavian entered the mausoleum, he expected to find Cleopatra trembling in despair, ready to be bound and paraded through Rome. Instead, he was met with stillness, a silence heavy as stone. The air was thick with incense, the chamber dimly lit by flickering oil lamps that cast long, wavering shadows upon the golden walls. And there she lay, Cleopatra reclined upon her couch, clothed in white and gold, the diadem of Isis crowning her brow. Her beauty lingered even in death, her lips curved with the faintest trace of a smile. At her side rested Antony, and beyond her couch the loyal Iras and Charmian, their faces serene in eternal sleep. For a moment, Octavian stood frozen. He had sought to drag her to Rome in chains, to display her as a trophy before the Senate and people. Instead, he found her already gone, beyond his grasp, beyond humiliation, beyond conquest. "She has cheated you," murmured one of his officers. Octavian's face remained cold, but behind his eyes flickered something sharp, frustration, perhaps even admiration. Cleopatra had robbed him of his prize, yet in doing so, she had sealed her legend. Charmian, though barely breathing her last, stirred at his presence. With the strength of her final breath, she lifted her head, arranged the queen's diadem more perfectly upon Cleopatra's brow, and whispered, "It is well done, the work of a queen." Then her head fell, and she too was still. Octavian stood in silence. Around him, his men shifted uneasily, aware that they bore witness to something greater than conquest, the final act of a woman who defied the might of Rome itself at last. Octavian gave the order that Cleopatra and Antony be buried together. Though he had stolen Egypt, he could not steal the union of the lovers. Side by side they would rest, their story etched not in stone, but in the hearts of all who remembered. Thus ended the reign of Cleopatra the Seventh, last pharaoh of Egypt. Rome had won the land, but the queen's spirit, untamed, unbroken, eternal, belonged to no empire. Outside the Nile flowed on, carrying whispers of their love into eternity, its waters reflecting the first light of day. When Octavian's men moved through the palace, they touched treasures and silk. But what stayed with them most was silence, the hush that comes when a story turns from clamor to stillness. The artisans laid Cleopatra and Antony side by side upon a carved bier, she in the diadem of Isis, a lotus upon her breast, he with the stern, softened face of a warrior who had chosen love in the end. Priests chanted the old rites, and incense curled like a slow prayer. The city gathered not only to grieve, but to witness a choice that had refused humiliation. Egypt's last sovereign had kept her dignity. The lovers had refused to be trophies. As the funeral procession threaded through marble streets, torchlight painted long shadows, and the crowd felt in a single movement that an age had closed. The mausoleum was made to last, winged Isis over the door, scenes of Nile gods along the walls, an inscription like a benediction no chains could bind them in life or in death. Octavian could take the crowns and the granaries, yet the sight of those two still bodies inspired awe and a kind of hush the conqueror had not expected. For Alexandria, the burial did more than mark an end. It began a remembering, quiet, persistent, slow as the river itself, in kitchens and temples, at shipyards and hearths, people carried the memory forward. A mother hummed a line of an old song while a child fell asleep. A fisherman traced the outline of a coin and told his son the story of the queen who chose her fate. These small acts of remembering were not monuments of stone, but living things. The story passed, softened, and kept. The tomb would stand, but it was the murmurs afterward, the private rites, the whispered verses at the bedside, that would make the lovers immortal in the hearts of ordinary people. After the hush, voices gathered. Scribes set quills to parchment. Poets found lines that would not let them go. and storytellers learned to carry the tale across harbors and borders. In Alexandria, the queen became a guardian in song. In Rome, she was framed as a cautionary portrait by men who had won. Each teller rubbed the story on their own cloth. Historians shaped her for politics. Poets softened her into myth. And fishermen kept only the parts that warmed them at night. Centuries folded one upon another, and the tale passed through fresh hands. Medieval storytellers spun witch lore and wonder. Renaissance painters draped her in silks and gave her the face of a goddess. Shakespeare put their voices on the stage and set those voices to music that still echoes. With each retelling, the lovers acquired new meanings, chastised by winners, praised by dreamers, reborn by artists. The past did not vanish. It was revised, painted, sung, and sometimes forgiven. This slow, many-voiced shaping mattered because it let the story travel. Where political records cooled, human retellings kept heat. People found in the lovers different reflections, caution, courage, longing, and in that multiplicity, the tale became not a single monument, but a living thing. In quiet rooms and noisy markets alike, Antony and Cleopatra took on 1,000 small shapes, each one a way for a new listener to find what they needed: consolation, daring, or simply the comfort of a good, long story. Paint and performance gave faces to what words could only suggest. Artists rendered Cleopatra in 100 lights: proud queen, tragic martyr, alluring queen goddess, and painters found in Antony a noble ruin, a soldier beloved even in defeat. Their canvases framed moments that had vanished: the pearl, the barge, the last touch of a hand, Baroque drapery, romantic moonlight, Renaissance linework. Each era slid its own color across the lover's image and left it more tender, more terrible, more human. On stage, the lovers' voices returned again and again. Actors shaped their grief. Directors staged the banquets. And audiences watched with the same mixture of scandal and sympathy that had followed the real figures. When film arrived, the story moved into living motion: opulent sets, thunderous scores, faces that filled the darkened cinema with light. The spectacle made them visible to millions. And even when directors debated motive or morality, the central image endured to people bound by choice, not by fortune. Art and theater did something quietly miraculous. They translated empire-sized drama into intimate moments. A painting could make a viewer hold their breath. A scene on a stage could make a whole house lean forward. These private responses preserved Antony and Cleopatra not as historical footnotes, but as an experience felt in the chest, a way for strangers, centuries apart, to recognize love and its cost. When modern culture took up the tale, it multiplied. Films turned the Nile into cinema's greatest river. Costume designers revived Cleopatra's liner of jewels and thick eyeliner as high fashion. Songs and novels borrowed their names as shorthand for passionate, dangerous love. The 20th century screens made their faces household sights. Their gestures became motifs in music videos, runway shows, and album art. The romance was no longer just history. It was a language people used when ordinary words would not do. This was not only adoration. Sometimes it was reinvention. Each image borrowed what it needed: glamour, scandal, feminism, or caution. Some retellings emphasized strategy and intellect, others the tragic lure of desire. Yet the story's core, to people who chose one another against odds, kept returning. That constant reappearing made them both timeless and timely, an ancient tale that could still speak to modern hearts, a template for lovers who wanted to know how far devotion could go. As icons, they appear on magazine covers, in pop songs, and on the lips of lovers who use their names as shorthand for experience. Popular culture flattens nuance almost inevitably, but it spreads memory widely. For many, a single film scene is how they first meet the queen and the general. In that meeting, history is not lost, but given new life, a life people can hold, hum, or dress themselves into for a night. Beneath the spectacle, another kind of curiosity worked patiently: scholarly hands probing archives, divers mapping ruins, archaeologists brushing silt from coins. They hunted not for glamour, but for truth: the tomb, the palace foundations, a small artifact that might say more than 1,000 stories. Excavations at Topoceris Magna, underwater surveys near the ancient royal quarter, careful rereadings of coins and inscriptions. Each small discovery nudged the past back into clearer focus. The lost tomb became a gentle obsession for many. To find it would be to tie the lover's private end to a place in the earth. To fail would leave room for imagination, and imagination is sometimes kinder. Archaeology taught patience. Ruins are patient. Tides are patient. The work moves slowly, and the rewards are often modest: a bead, a shard, a buried altar. But these fragments braid the legend back to human hands. Scholars argued, sifted, published, and taught. The public watched documentaries and read reports. Hope, scientific and romantic, continued. Whether the tomb is found or not, the search is itself a kind of devotion. It's an attempt to press the past into the present without breaking it, to touch with careful fingers the place where two lives chose their last dignity. In the end, the loud, historic acts slip into quieter lessons. Listeners learn that power is fragile, that dignity is sometimes the last kingdom a person may hold, and that love can be both a saving current and a force that runs one upon the rocks. From the Nile come gentler teachings. Be patient, tend your people, feed the hungry before polishing the crown. Antony's devotion and Cleopatra's cunning become maps for lives, lived not only in great theaters, but in kitchen rooms and river, fields. Poets and musicians ground these lessons into lullaby form. Painters and filmmakers give them faces and light. Scholars place the facts on orderly shelves. The result is a story that both instructs and comforts. For those who have loved and lost, for those who fear losing dignity, for those who simply want a long and beautiful story at night, the tale supplies a hush. Two people chose one another, and in that choosing they made a shape that would outlast empires. Imagine, finally, a slow riverbank under a moon where the lovers walk without crowns. They speak softly of children's laughter and the smell of river tar. They fold petty politics into the small, steady joy of remembering together. This image is not a rewriting, but an act of mercy, a last bright comfort that a listener may carry into sleep. The lamps dim, the river breathes, and the story loud once with ambition and war eases into a lullaby that lasts all night.